Judge Richard Whitmore slammed his gavel down so hard the sound cracked through the courtroom like a gunshot, and he pointed a shaking finger at a 10-year-old boy standing beside a briefcase nearly as big as his own body. "Bailiff, remove this child before he embarrasses himself further." That single furious order was about to become the biggest mistake of the judge's career, because the boy standing there wasn't leaving. And what he was holding inside that old leather case was about to bring the whole rigged system crashing down around everyone in that room. If you're watching this, drop the name of your city in the comments so I can see how far this story has traveled. And please subscribe and stay with me all the way to the end, because you have never heard a story like this one. Ethan Carter did not flinch. He stood there in his slightly oversized white shirt, his polished but worn shoes planted firmly on the courtroom floor, and he looked up at Judge Whitmore with a calm that made grown men in the gallery shift uncomfortably in their seats. Somewhere behind him, his father, Michael Carter, sat frozen, his hands gripping the edge of his chair so tightly his knuckles had gone pale. "Ethan," Michael whispered, leaning forward, "Son, sit down, please." But Ethan didn't sit down. He set the briefcase on the small table in front of him, the same table where lawyers in expensive suits usually stood, and he unlatched it slowly, deliberately, the way his grandmother had taught him to do everything important with patience, because patience was armor. "Your Honor," Ethan said, his voice steady, even though his heart was hammering so hard he could feel it in his throat. "I understand I look out of place here. I understand you don't think I belong. But I'm not asking for special treatment. I'm asking for 5 minutes." A ripple of laughter moved through the gallery. Somebody near the back muttered, "This is a joke," and somebody else snapped a photo with their phone. Jessica Harrison, the opposing attorney, rose from her seat with the practiced smoothness of someone who had never once lost a case she cared to win. She smoothed the front of her blazer, tilted her head, and let a small, condescending smile spread across her face. "Your Honor, with all due respect to whatever is happening here," she said, "this is a courtroom, not a school project. I move that the child be removed and that we proceed with the scheduled testimony of our expert witness." "Seconded by common sense," Judge Whitmore muttered, and a few people chuckled. Michael's stomach twisted. He wanted to stand up, wanted to grab his son and pull him back to safety, because this humiliation, this laughter, this was exactly what he had feared the moment Ethan told him 3 nights ago that he wanted to speak in court himself. "Dad, I found something," Ethan had said that night, spreading papers across their kitchen table, his small hands trembling with excitement rather than fear. "I found something big. Ethan, it's 10 o'clock. You have school tomorrow." "Dad, listen to me. Please, just listen for 1 minute." Michael remembered rubbing his eyes, exhausted from a 16-hour day at the garage, exhausted from 3 law firms turning him away in the same week, exhausted from watching the walls close in on the only thing he had left of Angela. He remembered looking at his son's face so much like hers, especially around the eyes, and he remembered the way Ethan's hand shook not from fear, but from certainty. 1 minute, Michael had said. Ethan had slid a photocopy of an old property map across the table, then a second map beside it, newer, official-looking, stamped with a seal. "Look at the boundary line, Dad. Look where it used to be, and look where it is now." Michael had squinted at the 2 maps for a long moment before his breath caught in his throat. "That's not possible," he whispered. "It moved 14 feet, Dad. 14 feet exactly where your shop's back lot ends. That's not a mistake. Mistakes don't move exactly where they need to for somebody else to win." Michael had sat in silence for a long time that night, staring at his son, a boy who read court documents instead of comic books, a boy who had inherited every ounce of his grandmother's stubborn devotion to the truth. "Where did you even find this?" he had finally asked. "The county archive. Grandma took me on Saturday. I told her I needed to see the original survey records for the whole street, not just our lot." "Why the whole street?" Ethan had looked up at him, then his eyes older than his 10 years had any right to be. "Because I had a feeling it wasn't just us." That memory flooded back to Michael now, as he sat in the gallery watching his son stand alone at that table facing a judge who wanted him gone, and a lawyer who wanted to laugh him out of the building. Michael's hands trembled. Every instinct told him to stop this, to protect his son from the cruelty of a room built to crush people who looked like them. But another part of him, a quieter, more desperate part, remembered the look on Ethan's face 3 nights ago. The certainty, the fire. Judge Whitmore leaned forward on the bench, his patience visibly thinning. "Young man, I have given you far more courtesy than this courtroom typically extends to interruptions. Now, unless you have a law degree hidden inside that briefcase, I suggest—" "I have the truth in this briefcase," Ethan interrupted, and the courtroom went utterly silent. Nobody interrupted Judge Whitmore. Nobody. The judge's face flushed red. "Excuse me. I said I have the truth, Your Honor, and I think you should hear it before you decide whether or not I belong here." A woman in the second row gasped audibly. Somewhere behind Michael, an old man chuckled under his breath and murmured, "Well, I'll be." Jessica Harrison's smile faltered for the first time, just slightly, just enough that someone watching closely, someone like Ethan who had spent years learning to read people the way most kids learn to read cartoons, could see the crack forming. "Your Honor," she said quickly, "I really must object to—" "Overruled," Judge Whitmore snapped, not because he wanted to hear the boy, but because his pride would not allow him to look like he was afraid of a child. 5 minutes. That is all you get, and if this becomes a spectacle, I will have you removed myself." "Thank you, Your Honor." Ethan reached into the briefcase and pulled out the first folder. Michael watched his son's hands. They were steady now. Whatever fear had been there moments before had settled into something else entirely. Focus, the same focus Michael had seen in his own father's hands when he worked on an engine nobody else could fix. "This is the original county survey of Carter Auto Repair," Ethan said, holding up the paper for the judge and the court reporter to see. "Filed in 1974 when my grandfather bought the land. The boundary marker is right here at the old oak stump that still exists on the property today. You can go see it yourselves. It hasn't moved in 50 years. He set it down and pulled out the second document. "This is the new survey submitted by Harrison Legacy Development 3 months ago. Same property, same oak stump reference point. But look at the measurement here." He pointed, holding the paper toward the bench, even though he knew the judge couldn't see it from that distance. It didn't matter because the courtroom camera zoomed in, and later this exact frame would circulate across the internet 100 million times. 14 feet moved inward. 14 feet that used to belong to my dad's shop now belongs on paper to Harrison Legacy Development. Jessica Harrison stood again. "Your Honor, surveys have margins of error, and a child reading 2 documents does not constitute expert testimony." "That's true," Ethan said calmly before the judge could even respond, "which is why I didn't stop there." He reached into the briefcase again. Michael's heart pounded. He hadn't seen this part. Ethan had told him about the boundary lines, about the maps, but there had been more folders in that briefcase than Michael had realized, and now his son was pulling out a third one thicker than the first 2 combined. "This is a survey filed for the property at 214 Willow Street," Ethan said, his voice rising slightly, not from nervousness, but from something closer to righteous momentum. "Owned by the Douglas family for 31 years. Same surveyor, same company doing the measurements, Brooks Surveying Group, same 14-foot shift, and guess who now owns that 14 feet? Nobody answered. "Harrison Legacy Development," Ethan said. A murmur rolled through the gallery like a wave breaking against rocks. "That's a coincidence," Jessica said, but her voice had lost its earlier confidence. "Is it?" Ethan asked and reached for a 4th folder. "Because this is 88 Magnolia Avenue, the Freeman family, same company, same surveyor, same shift." He pulled out a 5th, 102 Cedar Lane, the Whitfield family. A 6th, 47 Poplar Street, the Simmons family. By the time Ethan set the 6th folder down on the table, the courtroom had gone so quiet that the only sound was the soft hum of the ceiling fans and the frantic scratching of the court reporter's keys, trying to keep up. Michael sat frozen, his mouth slightly open, staring at his son as if seeing him for the very first time. He had known Ethan was smart. He had known his son spent his weekends buried in old law books instead of playing outside with the other kids. But this methodical, devastating pattern, laid out folder by folder, this was something else entirely. This was a decade of quiet observation finally exploding into the light. 5 families, Ethan said, his voice trembling now, not with fear, but with the sheer emotional weight of what he was about to say. 5 black-owned properties in this town, 5 identical boundary shifts. 5 properties that all now legally belong in whole or in part to the same company that is currently trying to take my father's shop, the shop my mother helped him build before she passed away. He looked directly at Jessica Harrison. That's not a coincidence, ma'am. That's a pattern, and patterns don't happen by accident. Judge Whitmore cleared his throat sharply. Young man, I understand you feel passionately about your father's situation, but accusations of this magnitude require substantial evidence, not a stack of photocopies from a county archive. I know, Ethan said. That's why I have one more thing. He reached into the very bottom of the briefcase, and his hand hesitated there for just a moment, a small, almost invisible pause that only his father noticed because only his father knew what that pause meant. It meant Ethan was afraid. Not of the judge, not of Jessica Harrison, not of the crowded courtroom or the cameras or the laughter that had greeted him minutes earlier. He was afraid of what would happen the moment he pulled this last document out. Michael's stomach dropped. He remembered suddenly and vividly a conversation from 2 nights ago, a conversation he had tried very hard not to think about since. Dad, Ethan had said, sitting on the edge of his bed long after he was supposed to be asleep. I found something else, something about the judge. What do you mean something about the judge? I mean, I found his name on a public financial disclosure form. It's a document all judges have to file every year, listing what companies they have money invested in. Michael had felt a cold chill move through him, even before Ethan finished the sentence. And Judge Whitmore owns shares in Harrison Legacy Development, Dad. He's going to make money if we lose. Michael had not slept that night. He had lain awake staring at the ceiling, turning the information over and over, terrified of what it meant, terrified of what would happen if his 10-year-old son said that fact out loud in a courtroom controlled entirely by the very man being accused. Ethan, he had said quietly the next morning, you can't say that in court. Do you understand me? If you accuse a judge like that and you're wrong, or even if you're right and he doesn't like it, he could destroy us. He could make things so much worse. Ethan had looked at him with an expression Michael would never forget, patient, unshaken, and somehow older than any child had a right to be. Dad, things are already as bad as they can get. We're about to lose everything anyway. What's the difference between losing quietly and losing while telling the truth? Michael hadn't had an answer for that. He still didn't, not really, and now here they were, and his son's hand was trembling ever so slightly at the bottom of that briefcase, and the entire courtroom was leaning forward, sensing that something enormous was about to happen. Your Honor, Ethan said, and his voice cracked slightly on the word honor. Before I show you this last document, I want to ask you something. Judge Whitmore's jaw tightened. You are not in a position to ask me anything, young man. I know, Ethan said, but I'm going to ask anyway because somebody has to. The judge's face darkened. This hearing is concluding right now. Bailiff, is it true? Ethan said quickly, his voice rising over the judge's, cutting through the room like a blade, that you personally own shares in Harrison Legacy Development. The courtroom exploded into gasps and whispered exclamations. Somebody near the back stood up. A reporter in the 3rd row nearly dropped her notebook. Jessica Harrison's face went white, then red, then white again, and her mouth opened but no sound came out. Judge Whitmore's gavel slipped from his hand and clattered against the wooden bench. That is an outrageous and completely unfounded accusation. The judge said, his voice shaking with a fury that betrayed something far more dangerous than anger panic. It's not an accusation, Your Honor, Ethan said, pulling the final document free and holding it up with both hands, his arms straining slightly under the weight of what he was doing. It's a public record. Your public record. Filed with the State Judicial Ethics Board 2 years ago. I have a certified copy right here. Silence. Complete suffocating silence. Michael Carter sat perfectly still, his heart pounding so violently he thought it might crack his ribs watching his 10-year-old son hold up a single piece of paper that was about to tear apart the reputation of the most powerful man in Brookdale, Georgia. And in that frozen electric moment, before anyone in that courtroom could speak, before the judge could recover, before Jessica Harrison could object, before the bailiff could take a single step forward, Ethan looked directly into his father's eyes. And for just a second, the fear disappeared entirely from his face, replaced by something that looked almost like peace. Because whatever happened next, Ethan Carter had already done what every adult in that town had been too afraid to do for years. He had told the truth out loud in front of everyone to the one man who had the power to punish him for it. And nobody, not the judge, not the lawyer, not the laughing crowd that had mocked him just minutes before, nobody in that courtroom had any idea that this was only the beginning of what Ethan Carter was about to reveal. Because tucked inside that old leather briefcase beneath the folders already exposed, there was one more secret. A secret Ethan hadn't told his father. A secret so much bigger than boundary lines and stolen property that it would eventually reach far beyond Brookdale, Georgia, all the way to a state investigation, television cameras from 3 networks, and a courthouse steps press conference that would change the entire town forever. But that would come later. Right now, in this frozen, breathless moment, all that mattered was the sound of Judge Richard Whitmore's own gavel rolling off the bench and clattering to the floor, a small, hollow sound that echoed through the silence like the first crack in a dam about to break. Judge Whitmore stared down at the fallen gavel as though it belonged to someone else, as though the sound of it hitting the floor had happened in another room, another life, another version of this Tuesday morning that hadn't just collapsed in front of 200 witnesses and a live courtroom camera feed. "Order," he said, but his voice cracked on the word, and it came out sounding less like a command and more like a plea. "Order." He tried again, slamming his palm flat against the bench because the gavel was still rolling somewhere near his feet. Nobody in the gallery was listening to him anymore. They were listening to a 10-year-old boy. Jessica Harrison had finally found her voice, and she used it the way she used everything sharp fast, designed to cut off momentum before it could build into something unstoppable. "Your Honor, this is exactly the kind of theatrical nonsense I warned you about," she said, stepping forward, with her heels clicking against the floor like gunfire. "A child cannot simply wave around a piece of paper and accuse a sitting judge of corruption. This is defamation. It's a certified public record," Ethan said again, and this time his voice didn't waver at all. "You can verify it yourself, ma'am. The State Judicial Ethics Board website, financial disclosure filings are public information. I didn't hack anything. I didn't steal anything. I printed it from a government website my grandmother showed me how to search." "That doesn't mean what you think it means," Jessica snapped. "Then explain what it means," Ethan said and held the paper higher. "Explain why Judge Whitmore's name is listed as an investor with 11,000 shares in a company called HLD Holdings Group, and explain why HLD Holdings Group is the parent company that owns Harrison Legacy Development." The courtroom erupted again, louder, this time voices overlapping, someone in the back standing up entirely, a woman near the front, pressing both hands over her mouth. Michael Carter could not breathe. He watched his son standing there alone at that table, holding up a single sheet of paper against the full weight of the local justice system, and every protective instinct in his body screamed at him to run forward, to grab Ethan, to pull him out of that courtroom before something happened that could never be undone. But he didn't move, because some part of him, the part that had watched his son spend 3 sleepless nights buried in property records instead of playing outside the part that had watched Ethan's hands shake with excitement rather than fear when he laid out those maps on the kitchen table. Some part of him understood that this was no longer a moment where a father could protect his child by pulling him away. This was a moment where the only protection left was the truth itself spoken out loud in front of witnesses, where it could never again be buried. "Bailiff," Judge Whitmore said, his voice rising into something close to a shout, "remove the child from the courtroom immediately." The bailiff, a heavy-set man named Officer Reyes, who had worked in that courthouse for 14 years and had never once seen anything like this, hesitated. He looked at the judge. He looked at the boy. He looked out at the packed gallery, at the phones already recording, at the local reporter in the 3rd row who had stopped writing altogether and was now filming with her own phone held high above her head. "Your Honor," Officer Reyes said slowly. "With respect, sir, the boy hasn't done anything disruptive. He's answering the court's own questions." A murmur of agreement rippled through the gallery. Judge Whitmore's face went a shade of red that Michael had never seen on a human being before. "Excuse me." "I'm just saying, sir," Reyes said, shifting his weight uncomfortably, removing him now after he's made a specific factual claim about a public record that might not look right. "On camera, with respect." For the first time since Ethan had walked into that courtroom, Judge Whitmore looked genuinely uncertain. He glanced toward the gallery, toward the reporter with her phone raised, toward the dozens of other phones now recording from every angle, and something in his expression shifted. The fury didn't disappear, but it curdled into something colder, more calculating. "Fine," the judge said through clenched teeth. "The court will take a 15-minute recess to review the documents presented. When we return, I expect this display to conclude one way or another." He struck the bench again, harder this time though. Without the gavel it made almost no sound at all, and he rose from his chair so quickly that his robe caught on the corner of the bench and nearly tore. The moment he disappeared through the side door, the courtroom exploded into chaos. People standing talking over one another, someone shouting a question toward Ethan that he couldn't quite hear over the noise the reporter pushing forward with her recorder extended. Michael finally moved. He crossed the gallery rail in 2 steps, wrapping his arms around his son so tightly that Ethan gasped for breath. "Dad, I can't. I'm sorry," Michael said, his voice breaking completely now, tears he hadn't allowed himself to shed in months finally spilling over. "I'm sorry I didn't believe you sooner. I'm sorry I made you carry this alone." "You didn't make me do anything," Ethan whispered into his father's shoulder. "I wanted to." I know, baby. I know." Behind them, Jessica Harrison had already pulled out her phone, her thumb moving rapidly across the screen, her face pale and tight, with something that looked less like anger now, and more like fear. "Get me Robert Harrison," she said quietly into the phone, turning her back to the crowd. "Now. Tell him it's an emergency. Tell him the boy found the shell company." Michael didn't hear those words. Ethan did. And he filed them away the same way. He filed away everything in the quiet, methodical part of his mind that had been collecting pieces of this puzzle for 3 months, because the shell company was a phrase Ethan had never seen in any of his research, which meant there was more. 15 minutes later, the courtroom reassembled, and the air inside had changed entirely. The laughter from earlier was gone. The condescension was gone. In its place was something electric, something that made the hair on the back of Michael's neck stand up as he watched Judge Whitmore return to the bench, flanked now by a court clerk carrying a folder Michael didn't recognize. "The court has reviewed the documents provided," Judge Whitmore said, his voice flat, controlled, rehearsed in a way it hadn't been 15 minutes earlier. "While financial disclosure records are indeed public information, the mere existence of an investment does not constitute grounds for recusal, nor does it establish any wrongdoing in this proceeding." Ethan's stomach dropped. He had expected pushback. He hadn't expected the judge to simply wave it away as though 11,000 shares meant nothing. However, the judge continued, and something in his tone made Michael sit up straighter. "Given the unusual nature of this hearing, and out of an abundance of caution, I will refer the disclosure matter to the State Judicial Ethics Board for review, and I will recuse myself from any further proceedings in this case, pending that review." A wave of murmurs rolled through the gallery. "But," Judge Whitmore added, his eyes narrowing directly at Ethan, "let me be clear about something, young man. Recusal is not an admission of guilt. It is a formality, and it does not change the underlying facts of this property dispute, which will now be assigned to another judge for determination, a judge who will not be swayed by dramatic theater or by a child's misunderstanding of legal documents." "I understand, Your Honor," Ethan said quietly. "I never said you were guilty. I just asked a question." "You asked a question designed to humiliate this court," the judge snapped, and for just a moment, the mask cracked again, real fury bleeding through the practiced calm. "No, sir," Ethan said, and something in his voice made the entire room go still. "I asked a question because 5 families in this town lost pieces of their land to the same company using the same surveyor with the same exact measurement error, And the man who was supposed to decide whether that was fair happened to own stock in the company doing the taking. I didn't design that to humiliate anybody, Your Honor. I designed it because I couldn't sleep at night, knowing it was happening and nobody was saying anything. Nobody in the courtroom moved. Somewhere in the back, an elderly woman began to cry softly. Michael would learn later that her name was Dorothy Freeman, the grandmother of the Freeman family whose survey Ethan had pulled from his briefcase, and that she had spent 3 years believing she had simply lost her land to a paperwork mistake she was too old and too tired to fight. Judge Whitmore did not respond to Ethan directly. Instead, he turned to the court clerk, muttered something too quiet for the gallery to hear, and struck the desk with his open palm since his gavel remained somewhere on the floor beneath the bench. Forgotten. This hearing is adjourned. The matter will be reassigned within 72 hours. Mr. Carter. He looked at Michael now, his voice tight. Your property will remain in its current legal status, pending the new hearing. No further action will be taken by either party until then. He stood, and without another word disappeared through the side door once more, this time not returning. The moment the door clicked shut, the courtroom broke into an uproar of noise, people standing talking, several strangers approaching Michael to shake his hand. A young man in a Brookdale Community College sweatshirt asking Ethan if he could take a photo for the school newspaper. But Ethan wasn't looking at any of them. He was watching Jessica Harrison. She stood at her table, papers half gathered in her arms, her phone pressed to her ear again, her voice low and urgent. I don't care what Robert says. We need to pull everything related to the Willow Street file before anyone else starts digging, she was saying, unaware that a 10-year-old boy 8 feet away was reading her lips with the same careful attention he gave to property surveys. If the ethics board gets involved, they're not going to stop at Whitmore's disclosure. They're going to want to know who set up HLD Holdings in the first place, and that traces straight back to. She stopped abruptly, noticing Ethan watching her. For just a moment, something passed across her face that Michael would later describe as pure, uncut fear, the look of someone realizing too late that the person they had dismissed as a harmless child had actually been listening the entire time. She gathered the rest of her papers quickly and walked out without another word. Michael knelt down in front of his son, gripping both of his shoulders. Ethan, look at me. What did you just hear? She said something about HLD Holdings being set up by somebody, Ethan whispered. Dad, I think there's more. I think this isn't just about Judge Whitmore owning stock. I think somebody built that company specifically to do this, to take land from families like ours. Michael felt something cold settle in his chest, the kind of fear that came not from immediate danger, but from the slow dawning realization that the thing his son had uncovered was far larger and far more dangerous than either of them had understood when they walked into that courtroom that morning. We need to go home, Michael said. Right now. Dad, wait. Ethan, please, we need to think. We need to talk to your grandmother. They left the courthouse together, weaving through a small crowd of reporters and onlookers who had gathered on the front steps, a crowd that had not existed when they arrived that morning, but had somehow materialized within the span of a single hearing drawn by whispers and cell phone videos that were already spreading faster than either of them could have imagined. A local reporter named Carla Jennings pushed a microphone toward Ethan as they descended the steps. Ethan, can you tell us how you found this information? Did anyone help you? My grandmother helped me learn how to search public records, Ethan said simply. Everything else I found on my own. Do you believe Judge Whitmore acted corruptly? Michael tensed, ready to pull his son away from the question, but Ethan answered before he could. I believe the truth matters more than what anyone believes about it, Ethan said. I found facts. What people do with those facts is up to them. Carla Jennings stared at him for a long moment, then lowered her microphone slightly, something like genuine astonishment crossing her face. How old are you again? 10, Ethan said. Almost 11. That evening in the small kitchen of the house Michael and Ethan shared on the edge of Brookdale, Linda Carter sat across the table from her grandson with a look on her face that was equal parts pride and terror. You went further than I told you to go, she said quietly. Her weathered hands wrapped around a mug of tea that had long since gone cold. I taught you how to search property records so you could help your father, not so you could stand up in open court and accuse a sitting judge of corruption in front of television cameras. I know, Grandma. Do you understand what you might have started today? Men like Judge Whitmore do not simply accept public humiliation and walk away quietly. Men like Robert Harrison do not build companies worth what Harrison Legacy Development is worth by playing fair when they're caught. I know, Ethan said again, quieter this time. Linda reached across the table and took his small hand in both of hers. I'm not angry with you, she said. I need you to understand that. I have never in my life been prouder of anyone. But pride doesn't keep people safe, baby. Truth doesn't always protect the person who tells it. Sometimes it just makes them a target. Michael, standing near the stove with his arms crossed tightly over his chest, finally spoke. Mama, what do we do now? Linda was quiet for the long moment, staring down at the folders Ethan had spread across the table. Once again, the same folders he had shown the courtroom that morning, plus several more he hadn't. We finish what he started, she said finally, because there's no going back now. Whitmore knows, Harrison knows, and within a day, maybe two, the whole town is going to know. She looked up at her grandson. So the question isn't whether we stop Ethan. The question is whether you're ready for what comes next. Because I promise you, baby, this is only the beginning. Ethan looked down at the folders on the table, at the careful notes he had made in his own handwriting over 3 months of quiet, patient research, at the names of 5 families who had lost pieces of their history to a company built, it seemed specifically to take it from them. I'm ready, he said. But even as he said it, he didn't fully understand what ready would actually mean. He didn't know that within 48 hours, Robert Harrison, the silent, rarely seen owner of Harrison Legacy Development, a man whose name Ethan had only encountered in passing corporate filings, would personally request a private meeting with Michael Carter, a meeting that would arrive wrapped in threats disguised as generosity. He didn't know that Judge Whitmore, humiliated in front of cameras and facing an ethics investigation, would not simply retreat quietly, but would instead reach out to old allies across the county courthouse, calling in favors that had been owed to him for nearly 2 decades. He didn't know that Jessica Harrison's frantic phone call in the courtroom, the one about pulling files about tracing HLD Holdings back to its origin, would set off a chain reaction inside the company that would nearly destroy the very evidence Ethan needed most. And he didn't know that the surveyor Daniel Brooks, the quiet, nervous man, who had stood at that courtroom podium presenting falsified measurements with a shaking voice, was about to make a decision that would either save this entire case or bury it forever. All Ethan knew, sitting at that kitchen table with his grandmother's hand wrapped around his and his father pacing anxiously by the stove, was that he had asked one question in that courtroom, and that single question had cracked something open in Brookdale, Georgia, that had been sealed shut for years. Something was coming. He could feel it, the way he felt a storm building in the air before the first drop of rain ever fell, a pressure, a stillness, a sense that the town he had grown up in was about to change in ways nobody, not even the boy who started it, could fully predict. Outside, the sun had already set over Brookdale, and in a house across town, in an office lined with dark wood paneling and framed photographs of himself, shaking hands with local politicians. Judge Richard Whitmore sat alone with a glass of whiskey he hadn't touched, staring at his own reflection in the dark window, replaying the moment his gavel slipped from his hand over and over again. And in a high-rise office 40 miles away, a man named Robert Harrison hung up his phone after a tense conversation with his niece Jessica and sat in silence for a long moment before pressing a single button on his desk intercom. "Get me everything we have on the Carter family," he said quietly. "Everything. I want to know who this child is who's been helping him, and I want to know by morning." Neither Michael nor Ethan Carter had any idea, as they sat together in their small kitchen, finishing a dinner that had gone cold, that somewhere across town, powerful men were already making decisions that would soon bring danger far closer to their door than either of them could have imagined. Danger that would arrive not in a courtroom, but in the quiet, ordinary hours of an evening that should have felt like relief, but instead felt like the calm before something much, much larger. Robert Harrison did not sleep that night. He sat behind his desk on the 14th floor of a glass building 40 miles from Brookdale, watching the same courtroom video loop over and over on his laptop screen, a 10-year-old boy holding up a single sheet of paper, A judge's gavel clattering to the floor, a courtroom full of strangers gasping in unison. Someone had already uploaded it online. By midnight, it had 30,000 views. By 2 in the morning, it had crossed 200,000. "Uncle Robert," Jessica said, standing in the doorway of his office. Her blazer wrinkled, her voice hoarse from hours of phone calls. "I need you to understand how bad this could get if the ethics board decides to pull the corporate filings." "I understand exactly how bad it could get," Robert said without looking up from the screen. "I built this company, Jessica. I know precisely how bad it could get." "Then what do we do?" Robert finally turned to face her, and there was nothing warm in his expression. Nothing that resembled the charming, philanthropic businessman who smiled from billboards across 3 counties. "We do what we've always done," he said. "We contain it." Containing a viral video isn't the same as containing a land dispute, Uncle Robert. There are cameras now. Reporters. That boy is 10 years old, Robert snapped, standing so quickly his chair rolled back and struck the wall behind him. "He is a child who got lucky finding 2 mismatched documents. He is not the problem. The problem is whoever taught him where to look." Jessica hesitated. "His grandmother, Linda Carter. She's a retired schoolteacher. She's been teaching him how to use the county archive system." Robert was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the dark skyline. "Find out everything about her," he said finally, "and find out who else knows what that family knows. I want a full accounting of every document that's left that house, every server it might be stored on, every person who might have seen it." "Uncle Robert, that sounds like—" "It sounds like protecting a company I spent 11 years building," Robert said sharply. "Do it quietly, do it carefully, and Jessica—" He paused, his voice dropping into something colder. "Do not let another child make a fool of this family in public again." Across town, in the small house on Baxter Street, Ethan Carter lay awake, staring at the ceiling of his bedroom, his mind racing through everything he had learned in the last 24 hours, unable to slow down enough to sleep. He could hear his father in the kitchen, still awake, the soft clink of a coffee mug against the counter, the low murmur of the television playing local news at a volume meant not to wake anyone. Ethan slipped out of bed and padded quietly down the hallway. Michael sat at the kitchen table, the same table where 3 nights ago Ethan had first spread out those 2 mismatched property maps, except now the local news anchor's face filled the small television screen propped against the counter, and beneath her in bold red letters, a headline scrolled across the bottom: "Brookdale Courtroom, Stunned as Child Confronts Judge Over Alleged Conflict of Interest." "Dad!" Michael turned quickly, wiping at his eyes, before Ethan could see clearly, though it was already too late. "Hey, bud, you should be asleep." "I couldn't." "Yeah," Michael said quietly. "Me neither." Ethan climbed into the chair across from his father, the same chair he had sat in every night of his life, for as long as he could remember, and for a moment, neither of them said anything at all. Just listened to the anchor's voice, reading a statement that had apparently been issued by the county courthouse less than an hour earlier. The State Judicial Ethics Board has confirmed it will open a formal inquiry into Judge Richard Whitmore's financial disclosures following a public hearing yesterday morning, the anchor said. Sources close to the courthouse described the inquiry as, quote, unusually fast-tracked, given the visibility of the case. Michael let out a long breath. They're actually doing it. They're actually looking into him. They have to now, Ethan said. Too many people saw it. Michael reached across the table and gripped his son's hand. I need you to promise me something, he said. What? I need you to promise me that whatever happens next, whatever these people try to do, you tell me, immediately. No more secret research at midnight, no more surprises in a courtroom. We're in this together now all the way through. Understood? Ethan nodded slowly. Understood. But even as he said it, some small, uneasy part of him wondered whether that promise would be possible to keep, because he had already noticed something on the drive home from the courthouse that he hadn't told his father yet. A dark gray sedan that had been parked across the street from their house when they arrived, its windows tinted, its engine running quietly in the dark. And though it had pulled away moments after they walked inside, Ethan hadn't been able to shake the feeling that it hadn't left because it was done watching. It had left because it had seen enough. The next morning arrived fast and loud. By 7 o'clock, 3 news vans were parked outside Carter Auto Repair, their satellite dishes raised toward the sky, reporters adjusting microphones as they prepared for live morning broadcasts. Neighbors gathered along the sidewalk in small clusters, some holding coffee mugs, others holding up phones to record the growing spectacle. Michael stood in the doorway of his garage, staring out at the chaos with a mixture of disbelief and dread. "Mr. Carter," a reporter called out, pushing forward, "can you comment on the ethics investigation into Judge Whitmore? Mr. Carter, is it true your son found evidence of 5 separate fraudulent land surveys? Mr. Carter, do you believe Harrison Legacy Development has been deliberately targeting Black-owned properties?" Michael raised both hands, his voice shaking slightly as he tried to speak over the noise. "I have no comment right now," he said. "Please, I just need to open my shop and get to work." But even as he said it, he knew work would not happen that day. Inside the small office attached to the garage, Linda Carter sat with the landline pressed to her ear, her face growing more troubled with every passing minute. "Yes, I understand," she said into the phone. "No, I'm telling you, we did not authorize any of this to be posted online. Someone in that courtroom recorded it and uploaded it themselves." She paused, listening. "A civil rights attorney from Atlanta." Another pause, longer this time. Yes, we would be very interested in speaking with her." She hung up the phone and turned to find Michael standing in the doorway, his face pale. "Mama, what was that?" "A woman named Attorney Renee Okafor," Linda said. "She saw the video last night. She specializes in civil rights and property law cases across the Southeast. She wants to represent us, pro bono." Michael sat down heavily in the nearest chair. "Pro bono. Mama, do you understand what that means? We've been rejected by 3 lawyers in this town who wouldn't touch this case for any amount of money, and now a stranger from Atlanta wants to do it for free." She said she's been tracking a pattern of similar land disputes across 4 counties for the last 2 years, Linda said quietly. She said Ethan's briefcase might be the first solid evidence anyone's ever managed to put together. Michael's hands trembled slightly as he processed the weight of what his mother was telling him. 4 counties, he repeated. "Mama, that's not 5 families. That could be dozens." "Maybe more," Linda said. "She's flying in tomorrow morning." Ethan, who had been sitting quietly in the corner, listening to every word, finally spoke. "Dad, I need to show you something else." Michael turned to him, exhausted, overwhelmed but unwilling, after everything that had happened in the past 2 days, to ever again tell his son to wait. "What is it?" Ethan pulled a folded piece of paper from his pocket, one Michael hadn't seen before, its edges worn soft from being handled repeatedly. "I found this 2 weeks ago," Ethan said. "I didn't show it to you because I wasn't sure what it meant yet, but after what I heard Jessica Harrison say in the courtroom about the shell company, I think I understand it now." He unfolded the paper and laid it flat on the desk. It was a corporate filing dense with legal language, the kind of document Michael would have skimmed past without a second glance. But Ethan's small finger pointed directly to a single line near the bottom. "Look at the registered agent listed for HLD Holdings Group," Ethan said. Michael leaned forward, squinting at the tiny print. His breath caught in his throat. "That's Judge Whitmore's brother-in-law," he whispered. "Gerald Voss. He was best man at Whitmore's wedding. Everybody in town knows him." "It gets worse," Ethan said quietly, sliding a second document beside the first. "This is the incorporation date for HLD Holdings. Look at it, Dad. Really look at it." Michael read the date, and for a long moment, the room seemed to spin slightly around him. 6 months before Harrison Legacy Development filed its first survey dispute against a Black-owned property in this town, Michael said slowly, understanding dawning across his face, like a sunrise breaking over something terrible. "They built the company specifically to do this. This whole thing was planned from the very beginning." "That's what I think too," Ethan said. "I think Judge Whitmore and Robert Harrison have been working together for years, and I think Gerald Voss was set up specifically to keep the judge's name off any direct paperwork, so nobody would ever connect them." Linda, standing near the doorway, pressed a hand against her chest. "Lord have mercy," she whispered. "This isn't just a property dispute anymore. This is a criminal conspiracy." The words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable, and for the first time since this entire ordeal had begun, Michael Carter understood with absolute clarity that his family had stumbled into something far larger than a fight over a repair shop. They had stumbled into a conspiracy that had been quietly stealing land from black families across the county for years, hidden behind fake surveys and shell corporations, and a judge willing to protect it all from the very bench meant to ensure justice. And somewhere out there, the men responsible for it now knew that a 10-year-old boy and his family were the only thing standing between them and continued freedom. That afternoon, a black town car pulled up outside Carter Auto Repair, drawing curious stares from the reporters still lingering nearby. The driver stepped out first, opening the rear door with practiced formality, and Robert Harrison emerged into the Georgia sunlight wearing a tailored gray suit that looked wildly out of place against the oil-stained concrete of the garage. "Mr. Carter," he said, extending a hand toward Michael with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I don't believe we've had the pleasure of speaking directly." Michael did not take his hand. "What are you doing here?" Robert's smile faltered only slightly before returning smoother than before. "I came to speak with you privately, man to man. I think there's been a significant misunderstanding about my company's intentions, and I'd like the opportunity to clear the air before things escalate any further than they already have." "There's a whole crowd of reporters standing 40 feet from us," Michael said. "Whatever you want to say, you can say it here." Robert's eyes flicked briefly toward the reporters, then back to Michael, his composure tightening almost imperceptibly. "I'd prefer somewhere more private," he said. "For your sake, Mr. Carter, not mine." Something in his tone sent a chill down Michael's spine, not quite a threat, but close enough to one that his instincts recognized it immediately. "My office," Michael said finally. 5 minutes." Inside the small, cluttered office attached to the garage, Robert Harrison sat in the chair across from Michael's desk with the relaxed posture of a man who had never once in his life worried about losing anything that mattered to him. "Mr. Carter, I want to make something very clear." Robert began folding his hands neatly in his lap. "I have enormous respect for what your family has built here. A man raising a child alone, running a small business, working with his hands, that's the American story I believe in." "Get to the point." Robert's smile tightened. "The point is that this situation has become far more public and far more complicated than it ever needed to be. Your son is clearly a very bright, very determined young man, but he's also a child, and children sometimes misunderstand complicated legal and financial matters. I'm concerned that this misunderstanding is about to cause a great deal of unnecessary pain for your family and for others." "Is that a threat?" "It's a warning," Robert said quietly, his voice losing its earlier warmth entirely. "There are powerful forces at play here that your son doesn't fully understand yet. I would strongly encourage you as his father to consider whether it's truly in his best interest to continue down this path." Michael's jaw tightened. "My son found evidence that your company has been stealing land from black families in this town for years. That's not a misunderstanding, Mr. Harrison. That's fraud." Robert leaned forward slightly, his eyes cold. "Careful, Mr. Carter. Accusations like that said aloud in front of the wrong people have consequences. I've built relationships in this county for decades, relationships with banks, with suppliers, with insurance companies that decide whether businesses like yours can even continue operating." The threat this time was unmistakable. Michael stood slowly, his hands trembling not from fear, but from a rage he hadn't allowed himself to feel until this exact moment. "Get out of my shop," he said quietly. "Mr. Carter, I don't think you understand." "I understand perfectly," Michael said, his voice rising now, 18 years of quiet, exhausted survival finally breaking loose into something fierce and unshakable. "You built a company to steal land from people who look like me. You bribed a judge to protect it. And now that a 10-year-old boy exposed you, you're sitting in my office threatening my livelihood instead of admitting what you did. Get out." Robert Harrison rose slowly from the chair, straightening his jacket with deliberate calm, though a muscle in his jaw twitched with barely restrained fury. "You're making a very serious mistake," he said. "The only mistake I made," Michael said, "was not trusting my son sooner. Robert left without another word, his driver already opening the town car door before he'd even reached the sidewalk, and as the vehicle pulled away from the curb, several reporters who had noticed the exchange began shouting questions after it, cameras flashing against the tinted windows. Michael stood in the doorway of his garage for a long moment, breathing hard, watching the car disappear around the corner, and he did not notice Ethan standing quietly behind him until his son spoke. "Dad, I heard everything." Michael turned quickly. "Ethan, I told you to stay in the back office." "I know," Ethan said. "I'm sorry, but Dad, I recorded it." Michael's eyes widened. "You what?" Ethan held up his grandmother's old cell phone, the screen still displaying a paused audio recording, the timer showing 4 minutes and 32 seconds. "I've been recording everything since the courtroom," Ethan said. "Grandma taught me that too. She said if powerful people are going to lie about what they did, we need proof of what they actually said." Michael stared at his son for a long moment, torn between overwhelming pride and overwhelming fear for what this recording might mean for all of them. "Ethan," he said slowly, "that recording, if it's real, if it's what I think it is, that could change everything, but it could also make things so much more dangerous." "I know," Ethan said quietly, "but Dad, I think it's too late to be careful. I think the only way through this now is straight through the middle of it." That evening, attorney Renee Okafor arrived a full day earlier than expected, stepping out of a rideshare in front of the Carter house just as the sun was beginning to set, a slim, black briefcase, considerably newer and more polished than Ethan's, clutched in one hand. She was a tall woman in her early 40s, sharp-eyed, dressed simply, but with the unmistakable bearing of someone who had spent years standing in courtrooms far larger and far more hostile than the one in Brookdale. "Mr. Carter," she said, shaking Michael's hand firmly on the front porch. "Renee Okafor, I apologize for the early arrival after I saw the recording your son mentioned on the phone earlier. I didn't think this could wait until tomorrow." Michael blinked. "You already talked to Ethan?" "Briefly on the phone with your mother's permission," Renee said. "He's a remarkable young man, Mr. Carter. I've spent 2 years chasing a pattern I could never quite prove. Your son proved it in 3 months, working alone with a library card and a lot of patience." She stepped inside, and within the hour, the small kitchen table that had once held 2 mismatched property maps was now covered entirely with folders. Ethan's original research, the recording of Robert Harrison's visit, and a thick stack of documents Renee herself had brought, detailing similar disputes in 3 neighboring counties. "Here's where things stand," Renee said, spreading a hand-drawn map across the table, red circles marking properties across a 4-county radius. Over the last 6 years, at least 19 properties owned by Black families across this region have been disputed using suspiciously similar boundary surveys. All conducted directly or indirectly by contractors connected to Brooks Surveying Group. All eventually absorbed in whole or in part by companies that trace back to HLD Holdings. Michael stared at the map at the sheer scale of what his son had stumbled into. 19 families. "At least," Renee said grimly. "And I believe there are more we haven't identified yet." "How is this even possible?" Michael asked, his voice hollow with disbelief. "How does something like this happen for 6 years without anyone noticing?" Renee's expression darkened. "Because the people who noticed were told over and over by attorneys, by county officials, by judges that they didn't have a case. Because most of these families didn't have the resources to fight back, and the ones who tried were quietly discouraged. Or worse." "Worse." Renee hesitated before answering. 2 years ago, a man named Curtis Bell filed a formal complaint against Brooks Surveying Group after discovering a similar discrepancy on his property. 3 weeks after filing his complaint, was mysteriously withdrawn. When I tried to reach him for an interview last year, his family told me he'd moved out of state and didn't wish to discuss it further. A heavy silence settled over the kitchen. "You think he was threatened?" Michael said quietly. "I think it's possible," Renee said, "which is exactly why I need you and Ethan to understand something before we go any further with this. What your son started in that courtroom 2 days ago is no longer just about your property, Mr. Carter. It's about to become one of the largest civil rights land fraud investigations this state has seen in a decade. And the people responsible for it have already shown in your own garage this afternoon that they're willing to threaten a small business owner in broad daylight to make it stop. She looked directly at Ethan, who sat quietly at the edge of the table listening to every word with the same careful focus he brought to every document he'd ever studied. "Ethan," she said gently, "I need to ask you something important, and I need you to answer honestly. Are you scared?" Ethan considered the question for a long moment before answering. "Yes," he said finally, "but I was scared before too. I was scared we were going to lose the shop. I was scared Dad was going to have to close it down and we'd lose the last thing Mom helped build. Being scared isn't new. The only thing that's different now is that I'm not scared alone anymore." Renee's expression softened, something close to admiration crossing her sharp features. "Well," she said, closing the folder in front of her with quiet determination, "then let's make sure you never have to be." Over the following week, the investigation accelerated at a pace none of them could have fully anticipated. Renee filed a formal request with the State Judicial Ethics Board, attaching the recording of Robert Harrison's visit to Michael's garage, along with the corporate filings Ethan had uncovered linking HLD Holdings to Gerald Voss, and through him indirectly to Judge Whitmore. Within 3 days, the Ethics Board's routine inquiry escalated into a full-scale investigation. Within 5 days, the local district attorney's office announced it was opening a parallel criminal inquiry into Harrison Legacy Development and Brooks Surveying Group. And within 7 days, the story that had begun as a single viral courtroom video had exploded into a national headline picked up by 3 major news networks, each competing to tell the story of the boy who had walked into a courtroom carrying nothing but a briefcase and a question, and had somehow cracked open a conspiracy that stretched across 4 counties and 6 years. But not everyone in Brookdale welcomed the sudden national attention. On the 8th night, as Michael locked up the garage later than usual, he noticed the same dark gray sedan Ethan had spotted days earlier, parked once again across the street, its engine idling quietly in the dark. He stood frozen at the edge of the sidewalk, watching it, his heart pounding. The driver's side window rolled down slowly, revealing not a stranger, but a face Michael recognized instantly. Officer Reyes, the bailiff from the courtroom, still in plain clothes, his expression tight with worry. "Mr. Carter," Reyes said quietly, leaning out slightly, "I need to talk to you, quickly and quietly." Michael approached cautiously. "Officer Reyes, what are you doing here?" "I've been keeping an eye on your house the last few nights," Reyes admitted, "off the record, because I overheard something at the courthouse yesterday that I think you need to know." Michael's stomach tightened. "What did you hear?" Reyes glanced around the quiet street before answering, his voice dropping even lower. "Judge Whitmore met privately with Robert Harrison this afternoon, in the judge's chambers after hours off the books. I wasn't supposed to be there, but I was finishing paperwork in the next room, and the walls in that old building aren't as thick as people think." "What did they say?" Reyes hesitated, his jaw tightening. "They're planning something, Mr. Carter, something involving the surveyor, Daniel Brooks. I heard Harrison say they needed him to, quote, disappear for a while before the ethics board could subpoena him to testify." Michael's blood ran cold. "Disappear," he repeated. "You mean—" "I don't know exactly what they meant," Reyes admitted. "It could mean paying him to leave town before he can be forced to testify against them. Or it could mean something worse. I honestly don't know. But I do know that whatever they're planning, it's happening soon. Maybe within the next day or 2. Michael's mind raced, thinking of Daniel Brooks, the nervous surveyor who had stood at that courtroom podium, presenting falsified measurements, his voice shaking with something Michael now understood, in hindsight had been genuine fear rather than simple nervousness. "If Brooks disappears," Michael said slowly, "the whole case could fall apart. He's the only person who could testify firsthand about who told him to falsify those surveys." "I know," Reyes said grimly, "which is why I'm telling you now off the record at real risk to my own job so that your lawyer can move faster than they can." Michael reached out and gripped the officer's hand firmly through the open car window. "Thank you. I mean it. Thank you." "Don't thank me yet," Reyes said quietly, rolling the window back up. Just move fast, Mr. Carter, and watch your family closely. Men like Harrison don't threaten people they don't intend to follow through on eventually. The sedan pulled away into the darkness, leaving Michael standing alone on the quiet street, his heart pounding, the weight of the officer's warning settling over him like a physical thing. He turned and ran back inside the house, finding Ethan and Linda still awake at the kitchen table, still poring over documents despite the late hour. "We need to call Renee right now," Michael said breathlessly. "It's about the surveyor, Daniel Brooks. They're planning to make him disappear before he can testify." Ethan's face went pale. "Dad, if Brooks disappears, we lose the one person who can prove someone told him to falsify those measurements." "I know," Michael said, already dialing Renee's number with shaking hands. Renee answered on the second ring, her voice sharp and alert, despite the late hour, and as Michael relayed everything Officer Reyes had told him, her responses grew increasingly urgent. "I need his address," she said. "Tonight. If they're planning to move on him within the next day or two, we need to reach him first before they do, whether that means convincing him to testify voluntarily, or at the very least, getting a protective order in place to prevent him from being pressured or relocated." "I might know where to find him," Ethan said, suddenly his voice cutting through the tense conversation. Everyone turned to look at him. "How?" Michael asked. "When I was researching the surveys, I found Daniel Brooks' business license application from 6 years ago," Ethan said, already reaching for one of his folders. "It listed a home address before he moved his office downtown. Small house on Miller Creek Road. I don't know if he still lives there, but it's a start." Renee's voice came through the phone tight with urgency. "Send me that address right now. I'm calling a colleague in Atlanta who specializes in witness protection filings. If we can reach Brooks before Harrison's people do, we might be able to get him somewhere safe, somewhere he can testify without fear of retaliation." "And if we're too late?" Michael asked quietly. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Then we lose our strongest piece of evidence," Renee said finally, "and this entire case becomes significantly harder to prove. Michael, I need you to understand something. What happens in the next 24 hours may determine whether this investigation succeeds or collapses entirely." Michael looked across the kitchen table at his son, at the exhausted determination etched into Ethan's young face, at the folders and photographs and hand-drawn maps that represented 3 months of quiet, dangerous work. "Then we don't sleep tonight," Michael said. "We find Daniel Brooks before they do." Outside, the dark gray sedan was gone, but somewhere across town in a house on Miller Creek Road that none of them had ever visited. A frightened man sat alone in his kitchen, staring at a phone he was too afraid to answer, having received 3 missed calls in the last hour, alone from a number he didn't recognize, a number that, unbeknownst to him, belonged to a company lawyer working directly for Robert Harrison, preparing to offer him a choice that would arrive before morning. Disappear quietly with a payment large enough to start a new life somewhere far away, or stay in Brookdale and face consequences that Robert Harrison had made chillingly, unmistakably clear would not be limited merely to his career. And as Michael Carter grabbed his car keys, his hands trembling with a mixture of fear and fierce determination, he had no way of knowing that the race to reach Daniel Brooks before Harrison's people did would become the most dangerous night his family had faced. Yet, a night that would test everything Ethan had built, everything Renee had fought for, and everything Michael thought he understood about how far powerful men would go to protect a secret worth millions of dollars and nearly 2 decades of stolen land. Michael's truck tore down Miller Creek Road faster than he had driven in years, gravel spitting from under the tires, his knuckles white against the steering wheel. Ethan sat beside him in the passenger seat, his grandmother's old cell phone clutched in both hands, Renee's voice still on speaker guiding them. "The house should be the 4th one past the creek bridge," Renee said, her voice tight with urgency. "Blue shutters according to the county record Ethan found." "I see the bridge," Michael said, slowing slightly as the headlights swept across a narrow wooden crossing. "Dad there," Ethan said, pointing. "The house with the porch light on." Michael pulled into the gravel driveway and killed the engine, and for a moment both of them simply sat there staring at the small house ahead, its porch light flickering weakly against the darkness. "Stay in the truck," Michael said. "Dad, Ethan, please, just this once." Ethan hesitated, then nodded reluctantly, watching through the windshield as his father walked up the porch steps and knocked firmly on the front door. Nothing happened for a long moment. Michael knocked again. "Mr. Brooks, my name is Michael Carter. I'm not here to hurt you or threaten you. I just need to talk." Still nothing. Then faintly the sound of a chain sliding, a lock turning, and the door opened just a few inches, revealing a sliver of Daniel Brooks's pale, exhausted face. "Carter," Brooks said hoarsely, "you shouldn't be here." "I know," Michael said, "but I think you're in danger, and I think you know exactly what kind." Brooks's eyes darted past Michael toward the truck, toward Ethan's small silhouette visible through the windshield, and something in his expression cracked slightly. "Is that your son? The boy from the courtroom?" "Yes." Brooks let out a long, shaking breath and opened the door wider. "You'd better come in, both of you, quickly." Inside, the house was dim, cluttered with unopened moving boxes stacked against the walls, as though Brooks had begun packing and then stopped halfway through, unable to decide whether he was running toward something or away from it. "They called me 3 times tonight," Brooks said, sinking into a worn armchair, his hands trembling as he spoke. "A lawyer. Said he represented Harrison Legacy Development. Said they wanted to offer me a, quote, generous relocation package. Said it would be in my best interest to accept it before the ethics board could issue a subpoena." "Did you accept?" Michael asked. "No," Brooks said quietly. "Not yet. But they made it very clear what would happen if I didn't." Ethan, who had quietly followed his father inside despite the earlier instruction to stay in the truck, stepped forward now, his voice steady. "Mr. Brooks, I know you're scared, but I think you already know that if you disappear, the surveys stay falsified, the families stay robbed, and Harrison and Judge Whitmore stay protected. You're the only person who can prove someone told you to move those boundary lines." Brooks stared at him for a long moment, something breaking visibly behind his eyes. "You don't understand what it's like," he said, his voice cracking. 3 years ago, Robert Harrison came to my office personally, told me my surveying license could disappear overnight if certain people made a phone call, told me my daughter's college tuition could suddenly become very difficult to afford if my business dried up. I didn't move those boundaries because I wanted to, Mr. Carter. I moved them because I was terrified of what would happen if I refused. Michael's chest tightened with something between anger and aching sympathy. "Then help us stop him," Michael said. "Testify. Tell the truth. Let this end with you instead of ending with someone else's daughter losing her home." Brooks buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking. The phone in his pocket buzzed suddenly, harsh and insistent, the screen lighting up with an unknown number. Everyone in the room froze. "Don't answer it," Ethan said quickly. Brooks stared at the phone for a long, agonizing moment, then silenced it, setting it face down on the table beside him. "They're not going to stop calling," he whispered. "Then let's give you somewhere to go where they can't reach you," Michael said, pulling out the phone Renee was still waiting on. "There's a lawyer on this call right now. She can get you protection, real protection, tonight." Brooks looked between Michael and Ethan for a long, tense moment, weighing 18 months of quiet fear against the trembling courage of a father and son who had shown up at his door in the middle of the night, unwilling to let him disappear into whatever silence Robert Harrison had planned for him. "Okay," he said, finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Okay, I'll talk to her." Michael handed him the phone, and as Daniel Brooks began speaking quietly with Renee Okafor, his voice growing steadier, with every sentence Ethan felt something loosen slightly in his chest for the first time in what felt like days. They had reached him first, but even as relief washed over him, Ethan's eyes drifted toward the front window, toward the dark road beyond the porch light, and he saw it. Headlights. Slowing. Turning into the driveway behind his father's truck. "Dad!" Ethan said, his voice suddenly sharp with alarm. "Someone's here!" Michael spun toward the window just as 2 car doors slammed shut outside, followed by the heavy, deliberate sound of footsteps crossing the gravel driveway. Brooks's face went white. "That's them," he whispered. "That's the lawyer's car. I recognize it from outside my office yesterday." Michael's mind raced. There was no back exit visible from where he stood, no clear way to get Ethan out of the house without walking directly past whoever was approaching the front door. A firm knock echoed through the small house. "Mr. Brooks?" A smooth, unfamiliar voice called from outside. "We know you're home. We just want to talk. Consider this a courtesy given the hour." Michael grabbed Ethan by the shoulder and pulled him gently but urgently toward the hallway, out of the direct line of sight from the front window, his heart hammering against his ribs. "Stay behind me," he whispered, "no matter what happens." Ethan nodded, his own heart pounding so hard he could feel it in his ears, and for the first time since he had opened that old leather briefcase in a courtroom full of strangers, he understood with sudden, terrifying clarity exactly how far these men were willing to go to protect their secret, and that the danger which had once felt distant and abstract was now standing directly on the other side of a thin wooden door waiting. The knock came again, harder this time. "Mr. Brooks, we're not leaving until we speak with you. This concerns your future and, frankly, your family's safety." Michael pressed his back against the hallway wall, one arm instinctively across Ethan's chest, holding his son still. Daniel Brooks stood frozen in the middle of his living room, the phone with Renee still on the line pressed against his ear, his face a mask of pure terror. "They can't know I'm talking to a lawyer," Brooks whispered, panic cracking his voice. "If they see her name on my call log—" "Hang up nothing," Michael whispered back fiercely. "Renee needs to hear everything that happens right now. She's your witness." Brooks nodded shakily and lowered the phone slightly, not disconnecting, just muting his own voice, letting the line stay open. The doorknob rattled. "It's unlocked, Mr. Brooks," the voice outside said, almost pleasant, almost gentle, which somehow made it worse. "We really would prefer not to stand out here in the cold." The door creaked open. Two men stepped inside, one tall and lean in an expensive coat, carrying a slim leather folder. The other broader, silent, positioning himself near the doorway, like a man whose only job was to make sure no one left before the conversation was finished. "Daniel," the tall man said warmly as though greeting an old friend. "I'm David Ferris, General Counsel for Harrison Legacy Development. We spoke on the phone earlier." "I told you I needed time to think," Brooks said, his voice shaking. "And we respect that," Ferris said smoothly, glancing around the cluttered living room, his eyes catching briefly on the moving boxes stacked against the walls. "Looks like you've already started making some decisions of your own, though." "That's none of your business." "Everything about you is our business right now, Daniel," Ferris said, his tone still pleasant, but carrying an unmistakable edge beneath it. "You signed those survey documents. Your name is on every falsified boundary line across 5 properties. If this goes to a criminal inquiry, you are not simply a witness. You are a co-conspirator. Unless, of course, we can come to an arrangement that protects everyone's interests." From the hallway, hidden just out of sight, Michael felt Ethan's small body go rigid beside him, and he tightened his grip protectively. "What kind of arrangement?" Brooks asked quietly. "A generous one," Ferris said, opening the leather folder and withdrawing a single document. "Relocation assistance, a new position with one of our partner firms in Florida, full financial support for your daughter's education, all of it contingent, of course, on you being unavailable for testimony over the next several months until this unfortunate media attention dies down." "And if I refuse?" Ferris's smile did not waver, but something in his eyes went flat and cold. "Then I'm afraid the company will have no choice but to pursue you personally for the fraudulent surveys you conducted," he said. "Your license, your business, your home, all of it becomes collateral in a legal battle you cannot possibly afford to fight. And Daniel, between us men who cross Robert Harrison rarely find their circumstances improving afterward." The threat hung in the air, unmistakable despite its careful, lawyerly phrasing. In the hallway, Michael's jaw clenched so tightly it ached. He could feel Ethan trembling slightly beside him, not from fear this time, but from something closer to fury. The same righteous anger Michael had felt in his own garage 2 days earlier, when Robert Harrison himself had sat across the desk and threatened everything Michael had built. Michael made a decision in that instant, one that would either save everything or destroy it entirely. He stepped out of the hallway. "That's enough," Michael said, his voice cutting through the tense living room. Ferris spun around, startled, his composure slipping for just a fraction of a second before snapping back into place. "Mr. Carter, I wasn't aware you'd be joining us tonight." "Clearly," Michael said, "since you just threatened a man's home and his daughter's education in front of witnesses." "This is a private conversation," Ferris said sharply. "It was," Michael said, "until you walked into it recorded." Brooks lifted the phone slightly, his hand no longer shaking, his voice suddenly steadier than it had been all night. "Mr. Ferris," he said, I want you to know that attorney Renee Okafor has been on this call this entire time. Every word you just said about withholding my testimony in exchange for compensation, she heard all of it." The color drained from David Ferris's face. For the first time since walking through that door, he looked genuinely visibly rattled. "That is an illegal recording," Ferris snapped, though his voice had lost its earlier smoothness entirely. "Actually," came Renee's calm, unmistakable voice through the speaker as Brooks raised the volume, "Georgia is a one-party consent state, Mr. Ferris. Mr. Brooks consented to this recording being made. Everything you just said is fully admissible." The silent, broad-shouldered man near the door shifted his weight uneasily, glancing toward Ferris as though awaiting instructions that clearly weren't coming. "This changes nothing," Ferris said, though the tremor in his voice betrayed him completely. "Whatever you think you've captured, it will hold no weight against the resources this company can bring to bear." "Maybe not alone," Michael said, "but paired with the corporate filings my son found, paired with the recording of Robert Harrison threatening me personally in my own garage, paired with 5 falsified surveys and a judge who owns stock in the very company he was supposed to rule against fairly, I think it's going to hold quite a bit of weight, Mr. Ferris." Ferris stood frozen for a long moment, his mind visibly racing, calculating, searching for some angle that would salvage the situation. He found none. "This isn't over," he said, finally snapping the leather folder shut with a sharp, futile gesture of control he no longer had. "Not by a long shot." He turned and walked briskly out the door, his silent companion following close behind, and moments later, the sound of an engine roared to life, outside tires spinning against gravel as the car peeled backward out of the driveway and disappeared into the darkness. For a long moment, nobody in the small living room moved. Then Daniel Brooks sank slowly into his armchair, the phone slipping from his trembling hand onto the cushion beside him, and he began to cry. Quiet, exhausted sobs that seemed to carry 3 years of accumulated fear finally breaking free all at once. "I'm so sorry," he whispered. "I'm so sorry for what I did to your neighbors, to your father's shop. I was a coward. I let fear make my decisions for 3 years, and good people paid for it." Michael crossed the room and knelt beside the chair, placing a steady hand on the man's shoulder. "You're not a coward tonight," Michael said quietly. "Tonight you chose the truth. That's what matters now." Ethan stepped forward as well, his small voice carrying a gentleness that seemed to catch Brooks entirely off guard. "Mr. Brooks," Ethan said, if you tell the truth about what happened, you're not just protecting yourself. You're giving 5 families their land back. You're the reason this whole thing might finally end the right way." Brooks looked up at the boy through tear-filled eyes, something like disbelief washing over his exhausted face. "How old are you?" he asked softly. 10, Ethan said. "Almost 11. Brooks let out a broken, astonished laugh. 10 years old, and you've already got more courage than I've had in 30 years. Renee's voice came through the phone once more, calm and steady, cutting through the emotional weight of the room with practical urgency. "Daniel, I need you to listen to me carefully," she said. "What just happened here tonight is enormous, but it's also dangerous. Harrison and his people now know that you've refused their offer, and they know it was recorded. That means the threat level against you has just increased significantly. I'm arranging emergency witness protection through the State Attorney General's office tonight. A car will be at your house within the hour to relocate you somewhere safe until you can testify formally." "And the recording?" Brooks asked. "I'm sending it directly to the district attorney's office and the ethics board the moment we hang up," Renee said, "along with a formal statement documenting tonight's attempted witness tampering. Daniel, this recording alone might be enough to bring criminal charges against Harrison Legacy Development's legal counsel, and it significantly strengthens everything else we've gathered." Michael helped Brooks to his feet, the man still shaking slightly but standing straighter now than he had since they'd arrived, something like relief slowly replacing the terror that had gripped him for so long. "Pack only what you need," Michael said gently. "We'll wait with you until the car arrives." For the next 40 minutes, the small house on Miller Creek Road fell into a strange, quiet rhythm, Brooks moving methodically through his belongings, gathering only the essentials, while Michael stood watch near the window, and Ethan sat quietly at the kitchen table, finally allowing himself, for just a moment, to feel the exhaustion of everything that had happened in the past 3 days catch up with him all at once. "Dad," Ethan said softly, his eyes heavy, his voice smaller than it had been all night. "Is this what it's going to be like now? Cars showing up in the dark, people threatening us?" Michael crossed the room and sat down beside his son, pulling him gently against his side. "I don't know," he admitted honestly. "I wish I could tell you it gets easier from here, but I can tell you this, whatever happens next, you're not facing it alone, not for one single second." Ethan leaned his head against his father's shoulder, and for the first time since walking into that courtroom 3 days earlier, he allowed the fear he'd been carrying quietly beneath his determination to finally show on his face. "I didn't think it would get this big," he whispered. "I just wanted to help you keep the shop." "I know, Bud. But now there's 19 families and a judge and a whole company and people threatening us in the middle of the night, and I don't know how to make it stop." Michael tightened his arm around his son, his own eyes stinging with tears he refused to let fall. Not now, not when Ethan needed him steady, more than he ever had before. "You don't have to make it stop," Michael said quietly. "You already did the hardest part. You told the truth when everyone expected you to stay silent. Now it's not just you carrying this anymore. It's Renee. It's Officer Reyes. It's Mr. Brooks. It's every family whose land got stolen finally getting the chance to fight back because you were brave enough to ask one question nobody else would." Headlights swept across the front window, followed by the quiet crunch of tires on gravel. Not the dark gray sedan this time, but a plain black SUV that pulled to a gentle stop directly in front of the porch. A woman in a dark jacket stepped out, flashing a badge briefly toward the window before approaching the front door. "State Attorney General's office," she said when Michael opened it cautiously. "I'm here for Mr. Brooks." 20 minutes later, Daniel Brooks stood on his own porch for what he quietly admitted might be the last time in months, a single packed bag at his feet, staring back at the small house that had held 3 years of fear he was finally truly leaving behind. "Thank you," he said to Michael, his voice thick with emotion. "Both of you. I don't know how to repay what you did for me tonight." "Testify," Ethan said simply. "That's all we need." Brooks nodded, managed a small, exhausted smile, and climbed into the waiting SUV, which pulled away into the darkness moments later, leaving Michael and Ethan alone once more in the quiet stillness of Miller Creek Road. They drove home in silence, both of them wrung out completely, the adrenaline of the night finally beginning to fade into bone-deep exhaustion. But as Michael pulled into their own driveway just past 3 in the morning, his headlights swept briefly across the front of their house, and he saw it immediately, his stomach dropping before his mind had even fully processed what he was looking at. Their front door stood wide open. "Dad!" Ethan whispered, his voice suddenly sharp with fear. "Dad, we locked that. I remember locking it before we left." Michael's hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white, his eyes scanning the darkened windows of the house for any sign of movement, his heart pounding with a fear entirely different from anything he had felt in that courtroom or in Daniel Brooks's living room. "Stay in the truck," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Lock the doors. Do not get out no matter what you hear. Do you understand me? Dad, please let me." "Ethan." Michael's voice cracked with a rawness that silenced any further protest. "I have already almost lost your mother. I am not losing you too. Stay in this truck." Ethan nodded, his small hands trembling as he reached for the door lock, watching through tear-blurred eyes as his father stepped out into the darkness and walked slowly, carefully toward the open front door of their home, toward whatever or whoever was waiting for him inside. Michael pushed the front door open the rest of the way, his heart hammering so violently he could hear it in his own ears, every muscle in his body coiled and ready. "Hello?" he called out, his voice shaking despite his effort to sound steady. "Is someone here?" Silence answered him. He stepped inside slowly, his eyes adjusting to the darkness, scanning the living room for any sign of movement. The couch cushions had been pulled loose and thrown to the floor. The drawers of the small entertainment stand hung open, their contents scattered. "Mama!" Michael called it, panic rising in his throat as he remembered with a sickening jolt that Linda had stayed home that evening while he and Ethan had gone chasing after Daniel Brooks. "Mama, are you here?" A muffled sound came from the hallway closet. Michael's blood turned to ice. He crossed the living room in 3 quick strides and yanked the closet door open, and there, curled into the small space between winter coats and a vacuum cleaner, was his mother. Her hands bound loosely with a length of cord, a strip of cloth tied gently but firmly across her mouth, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and fierce, unbroken defiance. "Mama!" Michael dropped to his knees, working frantically at the knots, his hands shaking so badly he could barely manage the fabric. "Mama, I'm here, hold on." The moment the cloth came free from her mouth, Linda sucked in a ragged breath and immediately grabbed her son's face with both trembling hands. "I'm all right," she said quickly before he could even ask. "I'm all right. Michael, listen to me. 2 men. They came in through the back door not 20 minutes after you left. I heard them searching the house, and I hid in here before they found me, but, Michael," her voice cracked, "they weren't looking for money. They were looking for Ethan's folders, the originals, all of it." Michael's stomach dropped through the floor. "Did they find them?" Linda shook her head, a small, exhausted smile breaking through her fear. "No. I hid the real ones in the garage inside your father's old toolbox weeks ago, the day after Ethan first showed me what he'd found. I had a feeling something like this might happen eventually. What they found in the house were copies. Copies I made specifically in case anyone ever came looking." Michael let out a breath he felt like he'd been holding for 3 days straight, relief and horror crashing through him in the same overwhelming wave. "Mama, they broke into our house. They tied you up. If Ethan and I had come home 10 minutes earlier. But you didn't," Linda said firmly, gripping his hands. "And I'm alive and the real evidence is safe, and that boy of yours is sitting in that truck outside right now, scared half to death. So go get him before he does something foolish and comes running in here himself." Michael turned toward the front door just as Ethan came bursting through it anyway, tears streaming down his face, throwing himself against his grandmother with such force that Linda nearly toppled backward. "Grandma, I heard you say something happened. I couldn't stay in the truck anymore. I'm sorry. Hush now," Linda said, wrapping both arms tightly around him despite the rope burns still visible on her wrists. "I'm all right, baby. I'm all right. It takes more than 2 overgrown bullies in ski masks to put me down." But even as she said it with forced lightness, Michael could see the exhaustion in his mother's eyes, the way her hands still trembled slightly, the way she kept glancing toward the back door as though expecting it to burst open again at any moment. "We need to call the police," Michael said, already reaching for his phone. "Already called Renee first," Linda admitted. "While I was still in that closet, if you can believe it. Managed to get one hand free enough to send her a text before they came back through the living room. She's already contacted the sheriff's department directly bypassing local dispatch." "Why bypass local dispatch?" Ethan asked, still clinging to his grandmother. Linda's expression darkened. "Because, baby, after everything we've learned this week about who might be protecting who in this county, I don't think we can afford to trust that the first officer who shows up isn't somehow connected to the very people who just broke into our home." The weight of that realization settled heavily over all 3 of them, and for a long moment nobody spoke. 20 minutes later, 2 sheriff's deputies from the State Division, Renee had specifically requested, arrived at the house, moving through the rooms with careful, methodical professionalism, photographing the ransacked living room, dusting for fingerprints, taking Linda's statement with a gentleness that suggested they, too, understood the delicate nature of what they were investigating. "Mrs. Carter," the lead deputy said gently, kneeling beside the couch, where Linda now sat, wrapped in a blanket, a cup of untouched tea cooling on the table beside her. "Can you describe anything distinctive about the 2 men, height, voice? Anything at all? One had a tattoo," Linda said slowly, closing her eyes, as though replaying the memory carefully in her mind. "On his left forearm. I caught a glimpse when his sleeve rode up while he was tying my hands. Some kind of bird. An eagle maybe, with something written beneath it. I couldn't make out the words." The deputy wrote this down carefully. "And the voices. One of them called the other Gerald at one point." Linda said, her eyes snapping open suddenly, her expression sharpening with sudden clarity. "I remember now, clear as day. He said, 'Gerald, check the garage next.'" Michael's head snapped toward his mother. "Gerald," he repeated slowly. "Mama, are you certain?" "Absolutely certain." Michael turned to Ethan, and he could see the same realization dawning across his son's face at exactly the same moment. "Gerald Voss," Ethan whispered. "The registered agent for HLD Holdings, Judge Whitmore's brother-in-law." The deputy looked between them clearly, sensing the sudden shift in the room's energy. "You believe you know who this individual is?" "We think so," Michael said carefully, glancing toward the phone Renee had insisted he keep on hand at all times now. "I need to call our attorney immediately. This isn't just breaking and entering anymore. This connects directly to the case." As the deputies continued processing the scene, Michael stepped into the kitchen to call Renee, relaying everything Linda had remembered, his voice low and urgent. "Gerald Voss," Renee repeated on the other end of the line, and Michael could hear the sharp intake of breath, the sound of her sitting up straighter wherever she was. "Michael, if we can place him at the scene of tonight's break-in, tied directly to the same corporate filing Ethan uncovered linking him to Judge Whitmore, that closes an enormous gap in this case. That's no longer circumstantial evidence of a financial conflict of interest. That's direct evidence of a coordinated criminal conspiracy, potentially including witness intimidation, breaking and entering, and unlawful restraint." "What happens now?" Michael asked. "Now," Renee said, her voice hardening with something Michael hadn't heard from her before. Not fear, but fierce, focused determination. "I make some calls tonight that are going to make Robert Harrison and Judge Whitmore very, very uncomfortable by morning." She was true to her word. By 6 the following morning, before the sun had even fully risen over Brookdale, 3 unmarked vehicles pulled up outside the county courthouse and a team of state investigators armed with a search warrant. Renee had spent the entire night helping secure through an emergency judicial order from a judge, 2 counties away, entered Judge Whitmore's chambers, and began systematically removing boxes of files. By 7 similar teams arrived at the offices of Harrison Legacy Development, and at the modest but well-kept home of Gerald Voss, whose forearm investigators would later confirm bore an eagle tattoo with a small inscription reading Semper Fortis beneath it, a detail that would match precisely with Linda Carter's description down to the last word. By 8 o'clock, as Michael stood in his kitchen watching the morning news with Ethan pressed close against his side and Linda sitting quietly at the table nursing a fresh cup of tea, the anchor's voice delivered words that made the entire room go still. In a dramatic overnight development state, investigators have executed simultaneous search warrants at the Brookdale County Courthouse, the corporate offices of Harrison Legacy Development, and a private residence connected to the case, following what sources describe as new evidence linking last night's break-in at the home of a local family to an ongoing land fraud investigation, first sparked by a 10-year-old boy's courtroom testimony earlier this week. Ethan stared at the screen, his young face a mixture of exhaustion, disbelief, and something that looked almost like awe at the sheer scale of what had unfolded in less than 72 hours. "Dad," he whispered, "is it actually working? Is this actually going to end?" Michael wrapped his arm tightly around his son's shoulders, watching the footage of investigators carrying boxes out of the courthouse, out of Harrison Legacy Development's glass office building, the same building where Robert Harrison had sat just 2 nights earlier, calmly plotting how to make a frightened surveyor disappear. "I don't know if it's ending," Michael said honestly, "but I think for the first time since this all started, they're the ones who are scared now." And somewhere across town in a 14th floor office that had once felt untouchable, Robert Harrison stood at his window watching state vehicles pull away from his building with boxes of evidence that would take investigators weeks to fully process. And for the first time in over a decade of building an empire on stolen land and buried secrets, he understood with sudden, gut-wrenching clarity that the 10-year-old boy he had dismissed as a harmless inconvenience 3 days earlier had just brought the full weight of the state down on top of everything he had spent years so carefully hiding. The days that followed moved faster than Michael Carter could fully process, each one bringing news that would have seemed impossible just a week earlier. Renee called before 8 in the morning, her voice tight with a mixture of triumph and caution that Michael had come to recognize as her default tone whenever something significant had happened. They found it, she said without preamble. Investigators recovered a complete set of internal emails from the search of Harrison Legacy Development servers. Correspondence between Robert Harrison, Judge Whitmore, and Gerald Voss going back 4 years. Michael. Explicit discussion of which properties to target, how to structure the falsified surveys, how to route the profits through HLD Holdings, so Whitmore's name never appeared on anything directly tied to the land. Michael sank into the kitchen chair, gripping the phone tightly. They actually wrote it down, all of it. People like Robert Harrison believe they're untouchable, Renee said. Untouchable men get careless. They stop worrying about paper trails because they've never had to answer for one before. What happens now? Now the district attorney is preparing formal charges, Renee said. Racketeering, fraud, conspiracy. Judge Whitmore is being charged separately with judicial misconduct and bribery, and given the severity, I expect his removal from the bench to be finalized within the week. Gerald Voss has already been arrested and charged with breaking and entering, unlawful restraint, and witness intimidation tied directly to what happened to your mother. Michael closed his eyes, feeling something in his chest finally begin to loosen after days of near constant tension. And Robert Harrison. There was a brief pause on the line. He hasn't been arrested yet. His attorneys are negotiating, trying to find some angle to slow this down. But Michael, I need you to understand something important. Men like Harrison don't go down easily, and they don't go down quietly. The next several days are going to be intense. There may be press requests, maybe even attempts by his legal team to discredit Ethan directly, to paint him as a coached child, rather than the person who genuinely uncovered all of this. Michael's jaw tightened. Let them try. That afternoon, as if summoned by Renee's warning, a segment aired on a rival local news station featuring an interview with an unnamed source described only as someone close to the Harrison family, suggesting that the entire courtroom incident had been orchestrated by Renee Okafor herself as a publicity stunt to build her civil rights practice, with Ethan serving as nothing more than a convenient, sympathetic face for a case she had already spent months building without his knowledge. Ethan watched the segment in silence at the kitchen table, his jaw tight, his hands clenched into small fists against his knees. "That's not true," he said quietly. "None of that is true." "I know," Michael said, sitting down beside him. "Everyone who matters knows." "But what if people believe it? What if they think I didn't really do any of it myself?" Linda, standing at the counter, set down the dish towel she'd been holding and crossed the kitchen to sit across from her grandson. "Ethan," she said firmly, "you have 3 months of handwritten notes in your own handwriting. You have library sign-in sheets from the county archive with your name on them. You have a grandmother who drove you there every single Saturday and watched you do the work yourself. The truth doesn't need anyone's permission to remain true, no matter how loud the lies get." Ethan nodded slowly, but Michael could see the worry still lingering behind his eyes, a new kind of exhaustion settling over his son that had nothing to do with physical tiredness and everything to do with the particular weariness of being a child forced to defend his own honesty against grown men with far more resources and far less integrity. The next morning brought an unexpected knock at the door. Not reporters this time, but a woman Michael didn't immediately recognize standing on the porch with a hesitant, almost apologetic expression, an older man beside her holding his hat against his chest. "Mr. Carter," the woman said, "my name is Rosalind Freeman. I believe your son found my grandmother's survey among the documents he presented in court." Michael's breath caught. The Freeman family, from Magnolia Avenue. "Yes, sir," Rosalind said, her eyes glistening. "My grandmother is Dorothy Freeman. She's the woman who was crying in the courtroom that day. She wanted to come herself, but her hip isn't what it used to be, so she asked us to come in her place." She glanced toward Ethan, who had appeared in the doorway behind his father. "Is this him? Is this the young man?" Ethan stepped forward shyly. "Yes, ma'am. I'm Ethan." Rosalind knelt down slightly, bringing herself to his eye level, and to everyone's surprise, she began to cry. "My grandmother has been fighting for 3 years to understand what happened to her land," she said, her voice trembling. "Every lawyer she talked to told her it was a lost cause, that fighting a company like Harrison Legacy Development was pointless for people like us. She stopped believing anyone would ever listen. And then you stood up in that courtroom and said her name out loud in front of everyone and proved that what happened to her wasn't some accident. It was theft. She reached out and gently took Ethan's small hand in both of hers. Thank you. From the bottom of my heart and from hers. You gave her back something we thought was gone forever. Not just the land. Her belief that the truth still matters. There, Amnanisa. Ethan didn't know what to say. He simply nodded, his own eyes filling with tears he hadn't expected, and Michael, watching his son absorb the full emotional weight of what his research had actually meant to real people beyond the walls of their own kitchen, felt something shift permanently in his understanding of what Ethan had accomplished. This wasn't just about saving the shop anymore. It never really had been, not entirely. It was about every family whose quiet suffering had been dismissed for years by people who assumed nobody powerful enough would ever bother to look closely. Over the following days, more families came forward, some in person, some through phone calls. Renee fielded at her makeshift office in a spare room of the Carter house, each one carrying a similar story of land quietly stolen through falsified paperwork, buried grief, and the exhausting realization that fighting back had always felt impossible until a 10-year-old boy proved otherwise. By the end of the first week, Renee's initial estimate of 19 affected properties had grown to 26, spanning 5 counties instead of 4. The true scope of Harrison Legacy Development's operation revealing itself layer by layer as investigators combed through the recovered emails and financial records. This is bigger than anyone imagined, Renee told Michael one evening, spreading a revised map across the kitchen table, red circles now covering an area that stretched far beyond anything Ethan's original research had uncovered. The district attorney's office has requested a formal task force, state level. This is no longer just a Brookdale case, Michael. This is becoming one of the largest land fraud prosecutions in Georgia in the last 20 years. Michael stared at this map, overwhelmed by the scale of it, by the sheer number of families whose lives had been quietly upended by a scheme that had operated in plain sight for years because nobody powerful enough had ever bothered to question it. Ethan didn't just save our shop, he said slowly, the realization settling over him with tremendous weight. He exposed something that was going to keep happening for years if nobody stopped it. Yes, Renee said quietly, he did. But even as the investigation gained momentum, even as more families found the courage to come forward, Robert Harrison had not yet been arrested, and his continued freedom cast a persistent shadow over every small victory the Carter family celebrated. That shadow arrived in physical form 11 days after the courtroom hearing that had started everything, when Michael returned from an evening supply run to find an envelope tucked into the mail slot of his garage door. No stamp, no return address, hand-delivered sometime while he'd been gone. Inside was a single photograph. It showed Ethan walking home from school 3 days earlier, captured from what appeared to be a significant distance. The image slightly grainy, but unmistakably clear enough to identify his son's face, his backpack, the exact route he walked every single afternoon. No note accompanied it. No words were necessary. Michael's hands shook as he stared at the photograph, a cold, suffocating fear settling over him, unlike anything he had experienced throughout this entire ordeal. They know his routine. They know exactly where to find him, when to find him, and they wanted us to know they know. He called Renee immediately, his voice barely steady enough to explain what he'd found. "I'm calling the sheriff's department right now," Renee said, her own voice sharp with alarm. "And Michael, I think it's time we discuss protective measures for Ethan directly. A police escort to and from school, possibly relocating temporarily until Harrison is formally taken into custody." "Relocating?" Michael repeated hollowly. "Renee, this is our home. Everything we have is here." "I understand that," Renee said gently. "But Michael, a man capable of orchestrating fraud on this scale, capable of ordering an assault on your mother, is now capable of anything if he believes his freedom depends on silencing a 10-year-old boy. I need you to take this as seriously as I'm taking it." Michael looked up to find Ethan standing quietly in the doorway of the kitchen, having clearly overheard enough of the conversation to understand its weight. "Dad," Ethan said softly, "is that photo of me?" Michael hesitated, torn between protecting his son from the full terror of what was happening and honoring the promise he had made days earlier. No more secrets between them, no more information withheld in the name of protection. "Yes," Michael said finally. "Someone left it in the mail slot tonight. No note, just the photograph." Ethan's face went pale, but he didn't flinch away from the truth the way Michael half expected. "They're trying to scare us into stopping," Ethan said slowly, working through it aloud the way he processed everything methodically, carefully. "But Dad, if they were confident this was going to just go away quietly, they wouldn't need to scare us at all. They're scared too. Maybe more scared than we are." Michael stared at his son, struck once again by the depth of understanding. This 10-year-old boy carried a clarity that somehow cut through the fear in a way Michael's own adult mind couldn't quite manage in the moment. "Maybe," Michael said quietly, "but that doesn't mean we're not going to take this seriously." Within an hour, a patrol car had been stationed discreetly outside their house, and by morning an unmarked vehicle sat parked near Ethan's school, a plainclothes officer positioned to monitor the property without drawing unwanted attention. Ethan hated it, hated the constant awareness of being watched, hated the way his classmates whispered when they noticed the unfamiliar car parked near the pickup line, hated most of all the fear he could see etched permanently now into his father's face every time Ethan left for school in the morning. But he understood why it was necessary, and he endured it with the same quiet determination that had carried him through every difficult moment of the past 2 weeks. 3 days after the photograph arrived, everything changed again, this time in a direction none of them had anticipated. Renee called just after 7 in the morning, her voice carrying a tone Michael hadn't heard from her before, not urgency, not caution, but something closer to stunned disbelief. "Michael, turn on the news right now," she said. "Channel 9, hurry." Michael grabbed the remote with shaking hands, and as the screen flickered to life, he found himself staring at live footage of federal agents, not state investigators this time, but FBI escorting Robert Harrison out of his 14th floor office building in handcuffs. His tailored suit rumpled his expression, a mask of barely controlled fury as reporters shouted questions from behind a hastily assembled barricade. "Breaking news out of Fulton County this morning," the anchor's voice announced over the footage, where FBI agents have arrested prominent real estate developer Robert Harrison on federal charges including wire fraud, racketeering, and conspiracy in connection with what investigators are now calling one of the largest coordinated land theft operations uncovered in Georgia in decades. Ethan came running into the living room at the sound of the broadcast, his eyes widening as he watched the footage, watched the man who had sat across from his father's desk just weeks earlier, threatening everything they had now being led into a federal vehicle with his hands cuffed behind his back. "Dad," Ethan whispered. "Dad, they actually did it. They arrested him." Michael pulled his son close, watching the screen with tears he no longer bothered to hide, relief crashing through him in waves so powerful his knees felt weak. "They did," he said. "They really did." The anchor continued, her voice carrying the particular gravity reserved for stories that had captured national attention. Sources within the investigation credit the breakthrough directly to evidence first uncovered by a 10-year-old Brookdale boy, whose courtroom testimony 2 weeks ago sparked what has since become a sprawling, multi-county federal investigation into judicial corruption and systematic land fraud targeting Black property owners across the region. Ethan stared at the screen, hearing his own story summarized in a stranger's voice on national television, and for a moment the sheer scale of everything that had happened since he first spread those 2 mismatched maps across the kitchen table threatened to overwhelm him entirely. "I didn't do this alone," he said quietly, almost to himself. "Mr. Brooks helped, Grandma helped, Renee helped, Officer Reyes helped. You started it," Michael said firmly, gripping his son's shoulders and turning him gently to face him directly. "Ethan, listen to me. None of those people would have known where to look if you hadn't found it first. You started something that's going to protect families for years to come, and I need you to understand what an extraordinary thing that is because I don't think you fully do yet." Ethan didn't answer immediately. He simply leaned into his father's chest, and for a long moment they stood together in the quiet living room, watching the television continue to replay footage of Robert Harrison's arrest. the weight of 2 exhausting, terrifying, extraordinary weeks finally beginning to lift from their shoulders. But even as celebration began to spread through Brookdale, even as neighbors gathered outside the garage that evening with homemade signs and casseroles and tearful expressions of gratitude, Renee's voice carried a note of caution during her final call of the day. "This isn't over yet," she reminded Michael quietly. "Harrison's arrest is enormous, but Judge Whitmore's disciplinary hearing is still pending. Gerald Voss's trial hasn't started, and Harrison's legal team is already signaling they intend to fight every charge aggressively. There's still a long road ahead. Michael and Ethan may still be called to testify formally in multiple proceedings." Michael absorbed this news with the same weary determination that had carried him through everything else. "Then we'll be ready," he said, "whatever it takes." That night, after Ethan had finally fallen asleep, actually asleep deeply and peacefully for the first time in nearly 2 weeks, Michael sat alone on the back porch of the small house he had built his entire life around, staring up at a sky full of stars, thinking about Angela, about the promise he had made at her graveside to protect their son, no matter what came. He hadn't expected that promise to mean standing beside Ethan while he took on a judge, a millionaire developer, and a conspiracy that had been quietly stealing land from families for years. He hadn't expected his son to be the one leading the way, small hands steady around folders of evidence while the adults around him struggled to keep pace. But sitting there under that quiet Georgia sky, Michael understood with absolute certainty that Angela would have been proud beyond words, not just of Ethan's courage, but of the truth he had insisted on chasing, even when every adult in his life had initially told him to sit down and stay quiet. Somewhere out there, 26 families were beginning the long process of reclaiming what had been stolen from them. Somewhere out there, a corrupt judge was facing the end of a career built on quiet betrayal. Somewhere out there, a man who had believed himself untouchable was sitting in a holding cell for the first time in his life, finally facing consequences he had spent years believing he would never have to answer for. And somewhere inside that small house behind him, a 10-year-old boy slept peacefully for the first time in 2 weeks, unaware that the story of what he had done was already spreading far beyond Brookdale, Georgia, into newsrooms, into law schools, into the hearts of families across the country who would soon hear his name and understand, perhaps for the first time in their own lives, that the truth was still worth fighting for, no matter how young or how powerless the person telling it seemed. The morning after Robert Harrison's arrest, Brookdale woke up to a different kind of town than the one it had been just 2 weeks earlier. Michael noticed it the moment he opened the garage. Neighbors who had never once stopped to talk, beyond a polite wave, now lingered at the edge of the driveway, some simply nodding respectfully, others crossing the street entirely, just to shake his hand. "Michael Carter," said an older man Michael recognized vaguely from church, gripping his hand firmly. "My grandfather lost 40 acres to a paperwork dispute back in the 60s. Nobody ever looked twice at it. Your boy just made this whole county remember what that kind of theft actually looks like." Michael didn't know how to respond to that kind of weight being placed so gently and so sincerely into his hands, so he simply thanked the man and watched him walk away, feeling something shift permanently in how the town regarded his small, oil-stained garage. Inside, Ethan sat at the kitchen table, finishing a bowl of cereal before school, seemingly unaware of the historic shift happening just outside their front door, his mind instead occupied with a much smaller, more immediate concern. "Dad, do I still have to go to school today?" "Yes," Michael said, unable to fully suppress a small smile. "The world may be falling apart around a corrupt judge and a federal indictment, but you still have a math test 3rd period. Ethan groaned dramatically, and for just a moment, watching his son roll his eyes at the mundane injustice of long division, Michael felt something in his chest loosen that had been tight for 2 straight weeks. His son was still underneath everything a 10-year-old boy who hated math tests and loved cereal with too much sugar in it. Somehow that small, ordinary detail felt like the most important victory of the entire ordeal. But normalcy, however welcome, did not last long. By the time Ethan returned from school that afternoon, Renee was waiting at the kitchen table with the expression that immediately told Michael something significant had happened. "Judge Whitmore submitted his formal resignation this morning," she said without preamble, sliding a printed statement across the table. "Effective immediately. He's attempting to resign quietly before the ethics board can formally remove him, likely hoping it will look less damning in the historical record. Does it matter? Michael asked. Resigning instead of being removed. Legally, not particularly, Renee said. The criminal charges proceed regardless of his position on the bench, but politically it's an admission. Men like Whitmore don't walk away from power voluntarily unless they know the alternative is far worse. Ethan, listening quietly from the doorway, stepped forward. What happens to all the other cases he ever ruled on? If he was corrupt this whole time, were all his decisions fair? Renee's expression grew serious. That's an excellent question, and one the state is already beginning to examine. There's discussion of a broader judicial review reopening any case where Whitmore's rulings might have been influenced by financial conflicts of interest. It could take years, Ethan, but it's possible more families beyond the ones directly connected to Harrison Legacy Development may eventually see justice because of what you uncovered. The scope of it settled over Ethan slowly, visibly, his young face working through implications that would have overwhelmed most adults. I didn't know one question could do all that, he said quietly. Most people never find out, Renee said gently, because most people never ask it. 2 weeks later, the town of Brookdale gathered for what local organizers called a community restoration assembly, held in the gymnasium of the same elementary school Ethan attended. Its folding chairs filled well beyond capacity, extra rows added along the walls to accommodate the overflow crowd. Dorothy Freeman sat in the front row, her hips still bothering her, but her spirit undimmed, flanked by 3 generations of her family. Beside her sat members of the Douglas Whitfield and Simmons families, names Ethan had first encountered as folders in an old leather briefcase, now sitting together as real people, healing together in the same room. When Ethan was called to the small stage at the center of the gymnasium, the applause that greeted him lasted so long he had to wait standing awkwardly beside the podium. His cheeks flushed until the noise finally settled enough for him to speak. He had prepared no formal speech. His grandmother had offered to help him write one the night before, but Ethan had gently declined. "I think I just need to say what's true," he had told her. "That's always worked before." Standing now in front of the packed gymnasium, he gripped the edges of the podium with both small hands and took a breath. "I'm not a hero," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the microphone despite its slight tremor. "I keep hearing people call me that, and I don't think it's true. I'm just a kid who noticed something wrong and couldn't stop thinking about it until I understood why." He paused, glancing toward his father in the front row, drawing strength from the steady, unwavering pride in Michael's eyes. "My mom used to tell my dad that the truth doesn't need anybody's permission to matter," Ethan continued. "I never really understood what that meant until a few weeks ago. I thought powerful people got to decide what was true because they had the money and the lawyers and the judges on their side. But I found out that's not actually how it works. The truth was always there in old documents nobody bothered to compare, and patterns nobody bothered to notice. It didn't need permission. It just needed somebody patient enough to look." The gymnasium had gone completely silent, hundreds of adults listening intently to a 10-year-old boy explaining in his own simple words something many of them had spent entire lifetimes struggling to believe themselves. "To the families here tonight," Ethan said, his voice growing steadier with every sentence, "I'm sorry it took this long for anyone to listen to you. I'm sorry you were told for years that fighting back was pointless. It wasn't pointless. It was just waiting for enough pieces to come together at once. And I hope from now on, whenever something like this happens again, and I hope it doesn't, but I know it might, I hope people remember that it doesn't matter how old you are, or how much money you have, or how many lawyers are standing against you. If you're patient, and if you're honest, and if you refuse to stay quiet, just because everyone expects you to, the truth eventually finds its way into the light." He stepped back from the podium, and the gymnasium erupted into applause so thunderous it seemed to shake the very foundation of the building. Dorothy Freeman, rising slowly to her feet, despite her hip tears streaming freely down her weathered face, an entire community standing together in a moment none of them would ever forget. Michael found his way to the stage afterward, pulling his son into an embrace so tight Ethan could barely breathe, both of them crying openly now in front of the entire crowd, neither of them caring in the slightest who saw. "Your mother would be so proud of you," Michael whispered into his son's ear. I don't have the words for how proud I am." "I miss her," Ethan whispered back. "I wish she could have seen this." "She saw it," Michael said, his voice breaking. "I believe that with everything I have, Ethan. She saw every second of it." Later that evening, after the crowds had finally dispersed and the gymnasium had emptied into the quiet Georgia night, Michael and Ethan walked slowly back toward their car, hand in hand, exhausted, but lighter than either of them had felt in years. "Dad," Ethan said quietly as they reached the parking lot, "is it really over now?" Michael considered the question carefully before answering, unwilling to offer his son false comfort after everything they had endured together. "The worst of it is over," he said finally. "Harrison is facing federal charges. Whitmore has resigned in disgrace and is facing his own criminal trial. Voss is awaiting trial for what happened to your grandmother. The families are beginning to get their land back. But Ethan, trials take time. There will be more testimony, more hearings, more moments where you'll have to be brave all over again." Ethan nodded slowly, absorbing this with the same quiet maturity that had carried him through everything so far. "That's okay," he said. "I think I understand now that being brave isn't just one moment in a courtroom. It's something you keep choosing over and over for as long as it takes." Michael squeezed his son's hand, unable to find words adequate enough to express the overwhelming pride swelling in his chest, and together they climbed into the truck and drove home beneath a sky full of stars, leaving behind them a town that had been transformed forever by one boy's refusal to stay silent, and ahead of them, though neither could yet fully see it, a future neither of them could have imagined just 3 short weeks earlier, one that would eventually carry Ethan's name far beyond the borders of Brookdale, Georgia, into courtrooms and classrooms and living rooms across the entire country. 6 months passed before Michael Carter truly believed it was safe to breathe again. The trials had come in waves, each one demanding something different from Ethan, from Michael, from the whole fractured, healing family that had somehow held itself together through all of it. Gerald Voss's trial came first, quick and almost anticlimactic. The recorded confession from that terrifying night on Miller Creek Road, combined with Linda's testimony about the eagle tattoo, leaving his defense attorney almost nothing to work with. He pleaded guilty to reduce charges rather than risk a jury and was sentenced to 11 years. 11 years. Linda said quietly, reading the verdict off her phone at the kitchen table. Her voice carrying no triumph, only a tired kind of relief. "For tying up an old woman in her own closet feels almost too short." "It's a start," Michael said, resting a hand on her shoulder. Judge Whitmore's case took longer, dragging through pretrial motions for months as his attorneys fought every piece of evidence, every subpoena, every attempt to compel testimony. But Daniel Brooks, safely relocated under state protection, never wavered once he'd made his decision that night in his living room. When he finally took the stand in March, he spoke for nearly 3 hours, detailing every threat, every falsified survey, every conversation with Robert Harrison that had slowly, methodically turned him into a man he no longer recognized. "I want the record to reflect," Brooks said near the end of his testimony, his voice steady in a way it had never been in that living room months earlier, "that a 10-year-old boy showed more courage confronting these people than I did in 3 years of quietly going along with what I knew was wrong. I'm not proud of that. But I am proud that when he asked me to tell the truth, I finally did." Ethan, sitting beside his father in the courtroom gallery, felt his chest tighten with an emotion he couldn't fully name, something between pride and sorrow, and a strange, aching gratitude for a man who had once falsified documents that stole his neighbor's land. Judge Whitmore was convicted on all counts in April: bribery, judicial misconduct, conspiracy to commit fraud, and sentenced to 8 years in federal prison, stripped permanently of his license to practice law. His name removed from the courthouse plaque that had listed his years of service, replaced within a week by a newly appointed judge whose first official act was ordering an independent review of every case Whitmore had presided over during his final 5 years on the bench. Robert Harrison's trial. The largest and most complex of all stretched across nearly 2 months. Federal prosecutors laying out a case built from thousands of documents, dozens of witnesses and financial records, tracing stolen land worth an estimated $14 million across 5 counties. Ethan testified twice, once in a pretrial deposition, once during the trial itself, and both times Michael sat close enough to reach his son's hand. The moment he stepped down from the stand, watching the exhaustion and relief wash over Ethan's young face in equal measure. "You did great," Michael whispered, after the second time, walking with his arm around Ethan's shoulders through the crowded courthouse hallway. "I just told them what I found," Ethan said quietly. "Same as always." Robert Harrison was convicted on every count in June. 22 years. When the verdict was read, Michael watched the man who had once sat across his garage office, threatening his family's livelihood, slump forward in his chair, his tailored suit suddenly looking too big for the shrinking, defeated figure inside it, and Michael felt no satisfaction in the sight of it, only a quiet, exhausted sense that something enormous and long overdue had finally been set right. Outside the courthouse that afternoon, reporters gathered in numbers Michael had grown almost used to over the past 6 months. Cameras and microphones extended toward the small family as they descended the steps together. "Ethan," one reporter called out, "how does it feel knowing your actions led to the conviction of a judge, a corporate executive, and a co-conspirator, all within 6 months?" Ethan considered the question carefully, the way he considered everything before answering. "It feels like justice took longer than it should have," he said. "But I'm glad it finally came." That evening, back at the house on Baxter Street, something had changed in the air that Michael couldn't quite articulate. Not celebration exactly, but a settling. A long-held breath finally released after nearly a full year of tension. "It's really over," Linda said, setting a pot roast on the table, the same recipe she'd made every Sunday for as long as Michael could remember. "All 3 of them, convicted, sentenced, gone. The families are getting their land back," Renee added, having become something close to a permanent fixture at their dinner table over the past several months. 26 properties, all in the process of legal restoration. Dorothy Freeman's family closed on their restored deed just last week. Ethan, quiet through most of dinner, finally spoke. "What happens to me now?" Everyone turned toward him. "What do you mean, Bud?" Michael asked. "I mean, for the last year, I've been the boy from the courtroom video, the boy who caught the judge. But the case is over now. What happens to that boy when there's nothing left to fight?" The table fell silent, each adult searching for an answer, neither obvious nor easy. Renee was the one who finally spoke. "Ethan, I think you're about to discover something important. The fight doesn't have to define you forever. It was one chapter, an extraordinary one, but one chapter. What you do next is entirely up to you." "I don't know what comes next," Ethan admitted. "Neither did I at your age," Renee said, smiling gently. "Neither does anyone really. You just keep being exactly who you already are, and the next chapter finds you." Ethan turned that over in his mind for a long moment, and something in his expression suggested the question would linger with him for a while, yet unresolved but no longer frightening. 3 weeks later, an envelope arrived at the house, bearing an official state seal addressed directly to Ethan Carter. Michael watched his son open it carefully at the kitchen table, his small hands steady now in a way that would have seemed impossible a year earlier. Inside was a formal invitation from the Georgia State Legislature requesting Ethan's presence at the signing of a new piece of legislation, one inspired directly by his case, establishing stronger oversight of property survey companies, mandatory financial disclosure reviews for judges presiding over land disputes, and an expedited legal pathway for families to challenge suspicious boundary changes without the crushing cost of private litigation. They were calling it informally, before its official name had even been finalized, the Carter Act. Ethan stared at the letter for a long moment, then looked up at his father, his eyes wide with disbelief. "Dad, they're naming a law after me." Michael took the letter gently from his son's hands, reading it over twice to make sure he hadn't misunderstood his own eyes, filling with tears he no longer bothered to hide in front of his son. "They're naming a law after what you did," Michael corrected softly, "so that no other family has to go through what we went through. So the next kid who notices something wrong has a system that actually listens, instead of having to fight for a year just to be heard. Linda, standing in the doorway, pressed a trembling hand to her mouth, tears streaming freely down her face. "Your grandfather used to say the law belongs to those willing to understand it," she whispered. "He never imagined it would one day carry our family's name." The signing ceremony took place on the steps of the state capitol in Atlanta. On a bright September morning, hundreds of onlookers gathered behind velvet ropes cameras from every major network trained on a small stage where the governor stood beside a podium waiting to sign the bill into law. Ethan stood beside him wearing a new suit his grandmother had insisted on buying for the occasion, his hands folded neatly in front of him, doing his best to look composed despite the roaring nervousness in his stomach. "Before I sign this bill," the governor said, addressing the crowd, "I want to acknowledge the young man standing beside me without whom none of this would exist. Ethan Carter is proof that courage has no minimum age requirement and that the fight for justice belongs to anyone willing to take it up, regardless of how young, how powerless, or how overlooked the world might assume them to be." The crowd erupted into applause, and as the governor signed the bill with a slow, deliberate flourish, Ethan felt his father's hand rest firmly on his shoulder from just behind him, steady and warm, the same hand that had gripped his through every courtroom hearing, every threatening phone call, every terrifying night over the past year. "Your mother would be so proud," Michael whispered, leaning down slightly. "I know," Ethan whispered back, and for the first time since this entire journey began, he allowed himself to simply feel the moment fully, without fear, without calculation, without the constant weight of what might come next. Just pride, just peace. Reporters swarmed the family afterward, and one question asked by a young journalist near the front of the crowd seemed to capture something the entire nation had been wondering since that first courtroom video went viral over a year earlier. "Ethan, what would you say to other kids out there who see something wrong in the world but feel too small, too young, too powerless to do anything about it?" Ethan thought about the question seriously, the way he thought about everything, and when he finally answered, his voice carried clearly across the crowded plaza, steady and sure. "I'd tell them that being young doesn't mean you're powerless," he said. "It just means people underestimate you, and sometimes that's exactly the advantage you need. Nobody expected a 10-year-old to notice a 14-foot boundary shift. Nobody expected me to keep asking questions after the first 3 lawyers told my dad to give up. But being underestimated isn't a weakness. It's cover. Use it. Ask the questions nobody else is brave enough to ask. Write down what you notice, even if nobody believes you yet. The truth doesn't care how old you are. It just needs somebody patient enough to find it and brave enough to say it out loud." The plaza fell into a hush, hundreds of strangers absorbing the weight of those words from a boy who had, over the course of a single extraordinary year, transformed from a frightened child standing alone in a courtroom into a symbol of what quiet, persistent courage could accomplish against even the most powerful forces determined to silence it. That evening back home in Brookdale, the Carter family gathered once more around the same kitchen table where this entire journey had begun. The table where Ethan had first spread out 2 mismatched property maps, where Linda had first taught him to read the quiet language of stolen boundaries, where Michael had first understood, with dawning horror and pride, exactly what his son had uncovered. Carter Auto Repair stood outside, freshly repainted its windows, replaced its future secure for the first time in over a year. The old leather briefcase that had once seemed too large for Ethan's small hands now sat on a shelf in the corner of the garage office, retired from active duty, its purpose fulfilled beyond anything anyone could have imagined the day Ethan first carried it through those courthouse doors. "You know," Michael said quietly, watching his son finish the last bite of dinner. "I used to lie awake some nights before all this happened, wondering how I was ever going to give you the kind of life your mother and I dreamed about for you. I felt like I was failing you every single day, working 16-hour shifts, barely keeping the lights on, watching lawyers turn us away, one after another." Ethan looked up at his father, listening quietly. "But I understand now," Michael continued, his voice thick with emotion, "that the greatest thing I ever gave you wasn't money or security or an easy childhood. It was letting your grandmother teach you to ask questions. It was trusting you even when I was terrified to follow the truth wherever it led. And Ethan, I promise you, whatever comes next in your life, whatever you choose to become, nothing you ever do will make me prouder than what you already did at 10 years old, in a courtroom full of strangers who told you that you didn't belong. Ethan reached across the table and took his father's hand, the same small hand that had once trembled while pulling a certified financial disclosure record from the bottom of an old leather briefcase, now steady, now sure, now carrying within it the quiet, unshakable confidence of a boy who had learned in the hardest way imaginable that truth was never too small to matter, and no one was ever too young to demand it. Because in the end, that was the story Brookdale, Georgia would tell for generations to come. Not simply the story of stolen land finally returned, or a corrupt judge finally removed, or a powerful man finally facing the consequences he had spent decades believing he would never face. It was the story of a 10-year-old boy who walked into a courtroom nobody thought he belonged in, carrying nothing but an old briefcase and one impossible question, and proved once and for all that the truth belongs to anyone brave enough to speak it, no matter how young, no matter how powerless, no matter how many powerful men stand in the way. And that truth once spoken can never again be silenced.